In the scorching sands of prehistoric Egypt, long before the first pharaoh united the two lands, primitive hunters gazed skyward and witnessed something extraordinary. High above the Nile's life-giving waters, falcons soared with an otherworldly grace, their keen eyes surveying the vast expanse below with divine authority. These magnificent predators, with their razor-sharp talons and piercing gaze, embodied everything the early Egyptians aspired to: power, vision, and dominion over their domain. From these ancient observations emerged one of Egypt's most enduring and complex deities, Horus, the falcon god, whose influence would span millennia and whose divine essence would become inseparable from the very concept of kingship itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that falcon worship in Egypt predates the formation of the unified kingdom by several centuries. Crude falcon images carved into rock faces and painted on pottery shards from the Gezer period, roughly 3,500 to 3,200 BC, reveal that these birds already held sacred significance among the scattered tribes inhabiting the Nile Valley. Unlike many deities whose origins can be traced to specific locations or events, Horus emerged from the collective consciousness of multiple communities, each recognizing the falcon's supernatural qualities and gradually weaving them into their spiritual beliefs. The transformation from local falcon spirits to a unified divine entity occurred gradually through the pre-dynastic period. Various tribes along the Nile developed their own falcon deities, each with distinct characteristics and powers. The inhabitants of Hierakonpolis, whose very name means City of the Falcon, were among the most devoted adherents of falcon worship. Their settlement, located in Upper Egypt, became a crucial centre for the developing Horus cult. Here, priests began systematizing the scattered falcon myths, creating a more cohesive theological framework that would eventually spread throughout Egypt. As these early communities interacted through trade and conflict, their falcon deities began to merge and evolve. The god who would become known as Horus absorbed attributes from numerous local falcon spirits, each contributing unique elements to his expanding mythology. This process of religious synthesis was not merely theological but deeply political, as emerging rulers recognized the power of unifying diverse spiritual traditions under a single, mighty deity who could legitimize their authority over previously independent territories. The celestial nature of Horus distinguished him from earthbound deities associated with specific natural phenomena or geographical features. Ancient Egyptians perceived the sky as a vast falcon whose outstretched wings provided shelter and protection for the world below. This cosmic falcon's body formed the heavens themselves, with his speckled breast representing the stars scattered across the night sky. His massive wings, spanning from horizon to horizon, created the dome under which all earthly life flourished. The eyes of this celestial falcon held particular significance in Egyptian cosmology. These luminous orbs, blazing with divine fire, were understood to be the sources of light that governed day and night. The right eye, burning with intense solar radiance, became associated with the sun's daily journey across the sky. Its fierce gaze could bring life-giving warmth or devastating destruction, depending on the falcon god's disposition. The left eye, cooler and more mysterious, represented the moon's gentle illumination, guiding travellers through darkness and marking the passage of time through its regular phases. This dual-eyed symbolism created rich mythological possibilities that Egyptian priests and storytellers would explore for thousands of years. The eyes were not merely passive sources of light, but active instruments of divine will, capable of independent action and possessing their own consciousness. They could detach from Horus's head to undertake specific missions, battle enemies, or bestow blessings upon worthy mortals. This concept of autonomous divine eyes would become central to numerous myths and magical practices throughout Egyptian history. The falcon's natural hunting behaviour provided additional layers of symbolic meaning. These birds possessed extraordinary eyesight, capable of spotting prey from tremendous heights with precision that seemed supernatural to human observers. Their hunting technique, soaring high above their territory before diving with incredible speed and accuracy to strike their target, became a metaphor for divine justice and royal authority. Just as the Falcon surveyed its domain from the heavens before swooping down to claim its prey, so too did Horus watch over Egypt, ready to strike down threats to cosmic order. The manifestations of Horus throughout Egyptian history reflect the complexity and evolution of his worship over 3 millennia. Rather than remaining a static deity with fixed attributes, Horus adapted and transformed as Egyptian civilization developed, absorbing new characteristics and taking on additional roles while maintaining his essential falcon nature. Horus the Elder, known in Egyptian as Horus or Horus the Great, represented the most ancient form of the falcon god. This primordial deity embodied the raw, untamed power of the sky and the fierce independence of the hunting falcon. Horus was a god of cosmic proportions, whose domain encompassed not just Egypt but the entire known world. His mythology portrayed him as a being of immense age and wisdom, present at the creation of the universe, and instrumental in establishing the fundamental order that governed all existence. The iconography of Horus the Elder emphasized his role as a sky god and cosmic ruler. Artists typically depicted him as a magnificent falcon with wings spread wide, or as a man with a falcon's head crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. His eyes blazed with the solar fire, and his talons gripped the symbols of pharaonic power, the crook and flail that would become standard regalia for Egyptian kings. In some representations, his body was covered with stars, reinforcing his identification with the night sky and his role as a celestial deity. Horus the Younger, called Hippocrates in later periods, emerged as Egyptian theology became more sophisticated and narrative-driven. This manifestation of Horus was deeply connected to the Osiris myth cycle and represented themes of renewal, legitimacy, and the triumph of order over chaos. Unlike his elder counterpart, who existed primarily as a cosmic force, Horus the Younger had a detailed personal history filled with dramatic events, family relationships, and heroic struggles. The iconography of Hippocrates differed significantly from that of Horus, reflecting his role as a more personal and accessible deity. Artists often portrayed him as a young man or even a child, emphasizing themes of potential, growth, and the promise of future greatness. He frequently appeared wearing the sidelock of youth, a hairstyle associated with children and young princes in ancient Egypt. In his child form, he might be shown suckling at the breast of his mother Isis, seated on a lotus flower, or playing with various animals, all symbols of innocence and divine protection. The sacred significance of falcons in ancient Egyptian culture extended far beyond their role as divine symbols. These birds occupied a unique position in the Egyptian understanding of the natural world, serving as intermediaries between the earthly and celestial realms. Their ability to soar to tremendous heights while maintaining perfect control and precision made them ideal representatives of divine power operating in the mortal world. Egyptian falconers developed sophisticated techniques for training and maintaining these sacred birds, skills that were often closely guarded, secrets passed down through generations of specialized priests and royal servants. The care and training of sacred falcons became an art form in itself, with elaborate facilities constructed within temple complexes to house these divine messengers. These falcon mews were not merely functional structures, but sacred spaces where the boundary between the divine and mortal realms became permeable. The hunting prowess of falcons provided a perfect metaphor for royal power and divine authority. Egyptian kings regularly participated in falcon hunts, both as practical training exercises and as ritual demonstrations of their connection to Horus. These royal hunts were elaborate affairs involving dozens of courtiers, specialized equipment, and carefully choreographed ceremonies that reinforced the pharaoh's divine nature and his role as Horus's earthly representative. The physical characteristics of falcons, their keen eyesight, swift flight, powerful talons, and fierce independence, became attributes associated with ideal kingship. A pharaoh was expected to possess the falcon's far-seeing wisdom, able to perceive threats and opportunities that others might miss. He should strike swiftly and decisively when action was required, showing no mercy to enemies of Egypt while protecting those under his care. The falcon's solitary nature also reflected the lonely burden of rulership, as the king, like the hunting falcon, must often act alone in making decisions that affected millions of lives. The evolution of Horus worship from local falcon spirits to a national deity paralleled the political unification of Egypt itself. As powerful leaders consolidated control over larger territories, they adopted and promoted religious symbols that could legitimize their authority over diverse populations. The falcon, already revered throughout the Nile Valley, provided an ideal unifying symbol that transcended local tribal loyalties while maintaining deep spiritual significance. This process of religious and political synthesis reached its culmination with the establishment of the Pharaonic system, where the king was understood to be the living embodiment of Horus on earth. This identification was not merely symbolic, but represented a fundamental theological principle that shaped Egyptian civilization for over 3,000 years. The pharaoh's divine nature as Horus incarnate provided the ideological foundation for absolute monarchy, while creating a spiritual framework that connected every aspect of Egyptian life to cosmic order and divine will. The divine falcon's ascension from local tribal deity to cosmic ruler would soon become entangled with one of the most tragic and consequential stories in Egyptian mythology. While Horus soared through the celestial realm as master of the sky, events were unfolding in the divine court that would forever alter his destiny and thrust him into a role far more complex than that of a simple sky god. The seeds of this transformation lay in the bitter jealousy and murderous ambitions of his uncle Set, whose actions would tear apart the divine family and plunge Egypt into chaos. Osiris ruled as king of the gods with wisdom and benevolence that brought prosperity to both the divine realm and the mortal world below. His reign represented the ideal of perfect kingship, just, merciful, and devoted to the welfare of his subjects. Under his guidance, the gods worked in harmony to maintain cosmic order, while humanity flourished under divine protection. Osiris taught mortals the arts of civilization, agriculture, law, religion, and the proper worship of the gods. His green skin symbolized the fertile earth and the promise of rebirth, while his mummified form represented the eternal nature of divine kingship. Beside Osiris stood his beloved wife and sister Isis, whose magical powers surpassed those of all other deities. Her knowledge of secret names, hidden spells, and the fundamental forces that govern creation made her the most formidable sorceress in existence. Isis served as both queen and high priestess, her wisdom complementing Osiris's justice to create a golden age of divine rule. Her devotion to her husband was absolute, and their love became the model for marital harmony throughout Egyptian culture. However, this divine paradise harboured a serpent in the form of Set, Osiris's younger brother. Where Osiris embodied order, fertility and life, Set represented chaos, barrenness and destruction. His domain encompassed the harsh desert, violent storms, and the untamed forces of nature that threatened civilized life. Set's physical form reflected his chaotic nature, sometimes appearing as a strange composite creature with a curved snout, square ears, and a forked tail, other times manifesting as a hippopotamus, crocodile, or other dangerous beast. The contrast between the brothers could not have been more stark. Osiris's subjects adored him, bringing offerings of grain, flowers, and precious goods to his throne. Set's followers were the creatures of the wasteland, scorpions, serpents, and jackals that thrived in desolation. While Osiris's voice brought comfort and wisdom, Set's words carried the sting of sand-laden winds and the rumble of distant thunder. The fundamental opposition between their natures created a tension that grew more unbearable with each passing eon. Set's jealousy festered like an infected wound as he watched his brother's reign bring unprecedented prosperity to the divine realm. Every success Osiris achieved, every innovation he introduced, every word of praise from their divine subjects served to deepen Set's resentment. The younger brother began to perceive himself as unfairly overshadowed, his own considerable powers dismissed as destructive and unwelcome, while Osiris received universal acclaim. This perception, whether accurate or distorted by envy, gradually transformed Set from a merely chaotic deity into something far more sinister, a god consumed by murderous hatred. The conspiracy Set devised demonstrated both his cunning and his intimate knowledge of his brother's character. Rather than challenge Osiris directly in combat, which might have failed given the elder brother's popularity among the other gods, Set chose to exploit Osiris's trusting nature and love of celebration. He organised an elaborate feast, ostensibly to honour his brother's achievements and demonstrate his own loyalty to the divine throne. The gathering would include the most prominent deities, creating witnesses to what Set planned to present as an unfortunate accident. Set commissioned the construction of a magnificent chest, crafted by the finest divine artisans to precise specifications that matched Osiris's exact measurements. The container was a masterpiece of decorative art, inlaid with precious metals, rare woods, and gemstones that caught the light like captured stars. Its beauty was so extraordinary that any god would covet such a treasure, making it the perfect bait for Set's trap. The chest's interior was lined with soft fabrics and cushioned to provide comfort, disguising its true purpose as an elaborate coffin. During the feast, as wine flowed freely and the assembled deities relaxed in celebration, Set unveiled his masterpiece. He announced a game. Whoever could fit perfectly inside the chest would win it as a prize. The challenge seemed innocent enough, even amusing after the evening's revelries. One by one the gods attempted to claim the prize, but each found the chest either too large or too small for their divine forms. The measurements seemed random, designed to fit no one present. When Osiris's turn arrived, he approached the chest with the same good-natured participation he had shown throughout the evening. His trusting nature prevented him from recognizing the trap, even as he lowered himself into the perfectly fitted interior. The moment Osiris settled into the chest, Set's conspirators sprang into action with coordinated precision. The lid slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and molten lead poured into the joints to seal it permanently. Bronze nails, each inscribed with binding spells, hammered through the lid to ensure no divine power could open it from within. The assembled gods watched in horror as they realized the true nature of Set's game. Osiris's muffled cries from within the sealed chest confirmed that even his divine strength could not break free from his brother's carefully prepared prison. Set's laughter filled the hall as he commanded his followers to carry the chest to the Nile and cast it into the current. The sacred river, which had always been Osiris's ally in bringing life to Egypt, now became the instrument of his apparent destruction. The chest containing the dying god floated down the Nile like a funeral barge, passing the cities and temples where Osiris had been worshipped. The river itself seemed to mourn, its waters turning dark and sluggish, as if reluctant to carry such a tragic cargo. Fish fled from the cursed container, while crocodiles that normally basked on the banks retreated into hidden caves. The natural world recognized that something fundamental had been disrupted, that the cosmic order itself had been wounded by Set's treachery. Eventually the chest drifted beyond Egypt's borders, carried by Mediterranean currents to the Phoenician coast near the city of Byblos. There it came to rest against a tamarisk tree growing at the water's edge. The tree, responding to the divine presence within the chest, began to grow with supernatural speed and size, its trunk gradually enveloping the container until it disappeared completely within the wood. The tree's rapid growth attracted the attention of the local king, who ordered it cut down and fashioned into a pillar for his palace, unknowingly incorporating Osiris's tomb into his royal residence. Meanwhile, Isis discovered her husband's absence and immediately began searching for him throughout the divine realm. Her frantic inquiries revealed the truth of Set's betrayal, filling her with grief so profound that her tears caused the Nile to flood its banks. The goddess's anguish manifested as physical phenomena. Storms raged across Egypt, crops withered in the fields, and the sun itself seemed to dim in sympathy with her sorrow. Isis's magical powers, normally used for healing and protection, now focused entirely on locating her missing husband. Using her knowledge of secret divination techniques, Isis traced Osiris's path down the Nile and across the Mediterranean. Her search took her far from Egypt, following mystical clues and divine visions that led her eventually to Byblos. There she learned of the miraculous tree and convinced the local king to give her the pillar, revealing her true identity and the sacred nature of what lay hidden within the wood. The king, awed by the presence of the Egyptian goddess, not only granted her request, but provided her with ships and supplies for her return journey. Isis carefully extracted the chest from within the tamarisk wood, her hands trembling as she finally held her husband's prison. When she opened the sealed container, she found Osiris's body perfectly preserved but lifeless, his divine essence having departed during his long imprisonment. The sight of her beloved's corpse unleashed Isis's grief anew, but alongside her sorrow came a fierce determination to restore what Set had destroyed. The goddess transported Osiris's body back to Egypt, hiding it in the marshes of the Nile Delta, while she prepared the most powerful resurrection magic ever attempted. Drawing upon spells known only to her, Isis began the delicate process of calling her husband's soul back from the realm of the dead. Her magic required absolute secrecy, as Set would certainly interfere if he discovered that his brother might yet be restored to life. However, Set's network of spies and informants eventually located the hidden body. Realizing that Isis might succeed in her resurrection efforts, he took drastic action to ensure his brother's permanent destruction. Under cover of darkness, Set and his followers attacked Isis's hiding place, driving off the goddess and seizing Osiris's corpse. What followed was an act of such savage brutality that it shocked even the chaotic god's own followers. Set dismembered Osiris's body into 14 pieces, each cut made with ritualistic precision, designed to prevent any possibility of magical restoration. He scattered these fragments across the length and breadth of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast to the southern cataracts, ensuring that no single location could become a focus for resurrection magic. Each piece was hidden in a different nome, often in places sacred to Set himself, where his power would prevent Isis from approaching safely. The mutilation of Osiris's divine form sent shockwaves through the cosmic order. The sun faltered in its daily journey, darkness crept across the land at inappropriate hours, and the Nile's life-giving flood failed to arrive on schedule. Animals behaved strangely, crops failed, and disease spread among both mortals and immortals. The very foundations of existence seemed to tremble as the murder of the rightful king created a wound in reality itself. Isis refused to accept defeat even in the face of this ultimate desecration. Transforming herself into a kite, she began a desperate search across all of Egypt for her husband's scattered remains. Her keen bird's eyes scanned every marsh, desert and mountain as she methodically combed the land for traces of divine essence. The search consumed months, during which Isis survived on determination alone, her divine form growing gaunt from exhaustion and grief. One by one, Isis located the hidden fragments of her husband's body. Each discovery required not only finding the physical remains, but also overcoming whatever guardians or obstacles Set had placed to protect his grisly trophies. Some pieces lay at the bottom of crocodile-infested pools, others were buried beneath temples dedicated to Set's worship, and still others were hidden in the lairs of monstrous creatures that served the Chaos God. The most challenging fragment to locate was Osiris's phallus, which Set had cast into the Nile, where it was immediately devoured by fish. This loss posed a seemingly insurmountable obstacle to Isis's resurrection plans, as the missing organ was essential for the magical restoration she envisioned. However, the goddess's knowledge of the deepest mysteries of creation enabled her to fashion a replacement from clay and gold, imbuing it with such powerful magic that it became more potent than the original. As Isis gathered each fragment, she performed preliminary preservation rituals to maintain the divine essence still clinging to the remains. Her magic worked to cleanse the corruption Set's touch had left on the body parts while simultaneously preparing them for the ultimate resurrection spell. The goddess's power grew with each successful recovery, as if Osiris himself was lending her strength from beyond death. When all the pieces had been collected, Isis retreated to a secret location in the Delta Marshes, far from Set's influence and protected by powerful concealment spells. There she began the most complex magical working ever attempted, the temporary resurrection of a completely dismembered god. Using techniques that combined traditional Egyptian magic with innovations born of desperate necessity, Isis slowly reassembled her husband's form. The resurrection ritual required perfect timing, aligning with celestial events that occurred only rarely. Isis waited for the proper conjunction of stars, the correct phase of the moon, and the precise moment when the divine and mortal realms drew closest together. As she spoke the final words of power, Osiris's reassembled body stirred with returning life, his eyes opening to gaze upon his beloved wife with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. However, the resurrection was necessarily temporary and incomplete. Osiris's divine essence had been too severely damaged by death and dismemberment to sustain permanent life in the physical realm. He could return only briefly, long enough for one final act of love and creation. In their last moments together, Osiris and Isis conceived a child who would carry within him the combined power of his divine parents and the burning desire to avenge his father's murder. The conception of Horus under these circumstances imbued the future god with unique characteristics that would define his entire mythology. Unlike other divine children born from simple desire or political alliance, Horus was conceived in an act of defiance against death itself, his very existence a declaration that Set's victory was incomplete. The child carried within his developing form not only his parents' divine attributes, but also the cosmic imperative to restore the balance his uncle had destroyed. As Osiris's temporary resurrection faded and his spirit departed for the underworld to begin his new role as judge of the dead, Isis found herself pregnant and utterly alone in a world still dominated by Set's chaotic rule. The goddess knew that her unborn child represented the only hope for restoring rightful order to the divine realm, but she also understood that Set would stop at nothing to eliminate this threat to his stolen throne. Isis retreated deep into the papyrus marshes of the Delta, using her magic to create a hidden sanctuary where she could give birth in safety. The location she chose was a floating island that appeared solid but could move at her will, drifting through the waterways to avoid Set's searching agents. Thick walls of reeds and rushes concealed the island from casual observation, while powerful spells deflected divination attempts and misdirected anyone who might stumble upon the sanctuary by accident. The birth of Horus occurred during a night of supernatural phenomena that announced the arrival of a god destined for greatness. Stars blazed more brightly than ever before, their light piercing through clouds that had obscured the sky for months. The Nile's waters ran clear and sweet for the first time since Osiris's murder, while flowers bloomed out of season throughout Egypt. Even in Set's strongholds, his followers reported strange dreams and omens suggesting that their master's reign faced a challenge. Isis gave birth to a son whose divine nature was immediately apparent. The infant Horus possessed eyes that blazed with inner fire, one bright as the sun and the other cool as moonlight. His cries had the piercing quality of a falcon's call, and when he grasped objects, his tiny fingers showed the strength that would one day wield divine weapons. Most remarkably, The child showed no fear of the dangerous marsh creatures that surrounded their sanctuary, as if recognizing them as natural allies rather than threats. The goddess faced the enormous challenge of raising her son in secret, while simultaneously preparing him for his destined role as Avenger and rightful king. Every aspect of Horus's upbringing had to be carefully planned to develop both his divine powers and his understanding of justice, leadership, and the cosmic principles his father had embodied. Isis became not only mother, but also teacher, protector, and guide, shaping her son into the weapon that would ultimately defeat Set and restore order to the universe. Ancient prophecies, whispered by the wind through the marsh reeds and revealed in the patterns of migrating birds, spoke of the child's destiny. Horus would grow to challenge Set's usurped authority, engage the Chaos God in battles that would shake the foundations of creation and ultimately reclaim his father's throne. The prophecies were both promise and warning, for they revealed that the path to victory would be long, dangerous, and marked by suffering that would test both mother and son to their limits. The isolated island sanctuary where Isis raised her infant son existed in a state of constant vigilance and perpetual motion. The goddess had woven protective spells into the very reeds and mud that formed their floating refuge, creating a living fortress that responded to her will and shifted position whenever danger approached. The papyrus stalks grew unnaturally thick and tall around their hideaway, their green walls reaching heights of 20 feet or more, while their roots intertwined beneath the water to form an impenetrable barrier against aquatic threats. The island's surface, though appearing solid, could compress and expand like a breathing lung, allowing it to sink partially beneath the water's surface when Set's aerial scouts passed overhead. Horus's earliest days unfolded in this verdant prison, where every sound carried potential menace and every shadow might conceal an enemy. The infant god's supernatural nature manifested in ways that both comforted and alarmed his mother. His cries possessed an otherworldly quality that could summon protective creatures from the marsh depths, while simultaneously alerting any nearby enemies to his presence. Isis learned to muffle these sounds with specialized magic, creating pockets of silence around her son that contained his voice, while allowing normal marsh sounds to continue unimpeded. The child's physical development proceeded at an accelerated pace that defied natural law. Within days of his birth, Horus could lift his head and focus his blazing eyes with the intensity of a hunting raptor. His tiny hands gripped objects with surprising strength, and his legs kicked with enough force to crack the wooden cradle Isis had fashioned from marsh reeds. Most remarkably, the infant showed an instinctive understanding of his surroundings, turning his head toward approaching dangers before his mother's enhanced senses detected them. Set's search for the hidden child began within hours of Horus's birth, as the Chaos God's supernatural senses registered the cosmic disturbance caused by the infant's arrival. The usurper king dispatched his most trusted agents throughout the Delta, creatures whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of power and whose cruelty matched their master's own ambitions. These searchers included demons with the bodies of men and the heads of various predatory animals, each possessing specialized abilities for hunting divine prey. Crocodile-headed scouts could remain submerged for hours while scanning underwater hiding places, while serpent-bodied trackers could slither through the narrowest reed passages without disturbing the vegetation. The most dangerous of Set's agents were the shape-shifting spies who could assume the forms of harmless marsh dwellers. These creatures infiltrated communities of fishermen and reed cutters, listening for rumours of strange phenomena or unusual animal behaviour that might indicate Isis's presence. They posed as migrating birds, floating logs, and even patches of lotus flowers, their supernatural patience allowing them to maintain their disguises for weeks while gathering intelligence about the goddess's possible whereabouts. Isis countered these threats through a combination of magical deception and strategic alliances with the marsh's natural inhabitants. She had cultivated relationships with the region's most formidable predators, convincing them that protecting Horus served their own interests in maintaining the Delta's ecological balance. Ancient crocodiles, some reaching lengths of 30 feet, became roving sentinels that patrolled the waterways around the hidden sanctuary. These massive reptiles had lived for centuries and possessed an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, making them ideal guardians who could distinguish between legitimate marsh dwellers and Set's infiltrators. The goddess's most trusted allies, however, were the 7 scorpions who had served her since before Osiris's murder. These were not ordinary arachnids, but divine creatures whose loyalty to Isis transcended death itself. Each scorpion possessed a distinct personality and specialized abilities that made them formidable protectors, despite their relatively small size. Tefen and Befen served as advanced scouts, their enhanced senses capable of detecting magical emanations from miles away. Mestet and Mestetef functioned as the group's strategists, their ancient wisdom providing tactical advice for avoiding or confronting threats. Petet, Thetet and Matet formed the combat wing, their stings carrying venom potent enough to kill even supernatural creatures. These scorpion guardians had accompanied Isis during her search for Osiris's scattered remains, proving their devotion through countless battles with Set's minions. Their small size allowed them to infiltrate enemy positions undetected, while their supernatural intelligence enabled them to coordinate complex defensive strategies. The scorpions could communicate with each other through subtle chemical signals undetectable to most enemies, creating an invisible network of information that kept Isis informed of threats approaching from any direction. The 7 scorpions' protective methods often involved preemptive strikes against potential threats. When Set's agents approached the sanctuary's general vicinity, the scorpions would stage elaborate diversions designed to mislead the searchers, while simultaneously eliminating the most dangerous individuals. Tefen might create false magical signatures that drew enemy attention to abandoned islands miles from Horus's actual location, while Petet and her sisters ambushed the responding forces with coordinated attacks that left no survivors to report back to their master. One particularly harrowing incident occurred when Horus was barely 3 months old and had begun to exhibit more obvious signs of his divine nature. The infant's eyes had started to glow with their characteristic solar and lunar radiance, creating light emissions that could potentially be detected by Set's magical surveillance. A pack of Werejackals, creatures that served as Set's personal hunting hounds, had picked up traces of divine energy emanating from the Delta region and were systematically searching every island and waterway. The Werejackals possessed enhanced senses that made them nearly impossible to deceive through conventional magic. Their supernatural noses could distinguish between thousands of different scent signatures, while their eyes could perceive magical auras invisible to other creatures. Most dangerously, they hunted in coordinated packs that could surround large areas and gradually contract their search perimeter until their prey had nowhere to flee. The pack investigating the Delta numbered 15 individuals, each the size of a small horse and possessing intelligence that rivaled many human scholars. Isis recognized that conventional hiding techniques would prove inadequate against such persistent and capable hunters. Instead, she chose to implement a desperate strategy that required her to temporarily separate from her infant son, while the scorpions maintained a protective perimeter around him. The goddess created multiple false trails using her own magical signature, leading the Werejackals on an exhausting chase through the most treacherous sections of the marsh while her son remained hidden under layers of concealment spells. The diversion nearly ended in disaster when one of the Werejackals proved clever enough to recognize Isis's deception and doubled back toward the sanctuary, while his packmates continued pursuing the false trails. This creature, a massive specimen with silver-tipped fur and eyes like burning coals, approached the hidden island during the darkest hour before dawn, when magical concealment was at its weakest. The beast's supernatural senses detected the faint emanations of divine power that even Isis's most sophisticated spells could not completely mask. Mestet, the eldest and wisest of the 7 scorpions, intercepted the Werejackal as it prepared to investigate the suspicious magical signatures. The ancient arachnid had positioned herself on a partially submerged log directly in the creature's path, her body motionless and seemingly lifeless. When the Werejackal lowered its massive head to examine what appeared to be ordinary marsh debris, Mestet struck with lightning speed, her stinger penetrating the soft tissue beneath the creature's jaw and delivering a dose of venom concentrated enough to fell a god. The Werejackal's death throes threatened to alert its distant packmates, but the remaining scorpions had anticipated this possibility. Working together, they used their combined magical abilities to create a localized silence field that contained the creature's agonized howls, while simultaneously generating false scent trails that would confuse any pack members who might investigate the sudden cessation of communication from their advance scout. This incident marked the beginning of an escalating campaign of violence between Set's agents and the protective forces surrounding Horus. The chaos god's frustration at his inability to locate the infant heir drove him to increasingly desperate measures, including the deployment of creatures so dangerous that they posed threats to innocent marsh dwellers, as well as his intended targets. Set's forces began systematically destroying sections of the delta, burning reed beds and poisoning waterways in an attempt to flush out their quarry through environmental devastation. Isis responded to these attacks by expanding her network of allies and implementing more aggressive defensive strategies. She forged alliances with the region's most powerful supernatural entities, including ancient spirits that had dwelt in the marshes since before the first pharaoh ruled Egypt. These beings, while not naturally inclined to involve themselves in divine politics, recognized that Set's increasingly destructive search methods threatened their own domains and way of life. The marsh spirits brought unique capabilities to Horus's protection that complemented the more direct approach of the seven scorpions. Will-o'-the-wisps, ethereal beings composed of swamp gas and starlight, could create elaborate illusions that misdirected enemy forces into quicksand pits or areas infested with venomous serpents. Water elementals reshaped the delta's geography on a nightly basis, creating new channels while closing off others to ensure that any map Set's forces might possess became obsolete within days. As Horus grew from infant to toddler, his divine nature became increasingly difficult to conceal. The child's supernatural strength manifested in ways that would have been amusing under different circumstances but posed serious security risks given their situation. Horus could tear apart wooden toys with his bare hands, and his excited movements while playing generated enough force to crack the specially reinforced floor of their sanctuary. His developing vocal cords produced sounds that range from perfectly human speech to falcon cries capable of being heard for miles across the marsh. Most challenging was the child's instinctive response to perceived threats. When danger approached, Horus's eyes would blaze with increasing intensity, creating light emissions that could potentially be detected by enemy scouts. His divine nature compelled him to face threats directly rather than hide, a tendency that required constant vigilance from his mother and guardians to prevent the young god from inadvertently revealing their location through premature displays of power. Isis began implementing a rigorous training regimen designed to help her son control his supernatural abilities while simultaneously developing the skills he would need for his eventual confrontation with Set. The goddess understood that Horus's survival depended not only on remaining hidden, but also on preparing him to defend himself when concealment was no longer possible. These early lessons took place in the deepest sections of their sanctuary, where thick layers of magical shielding prevented any emanations from escaping to alert potential enemies. The child's education encompassed multiple disciplines that would serve him throughout his divine career. Isis taught him the fundamental principles of magic, starting with simple spells for concealment and misdirection before progressing to more complex workings involving elemental manipulation and divine transformation. Horus proved to be an exceptionally gifted student, his natural magical talent enhanced by his unique parentage and the circumstances of his conception during his father's temporary resurrection. Combat training began almost as soon as Horus could walk steadily. Isis had recovered several of Osiris's weapons from hidden caches throughout Egypt, divine artifacts that had been crafted specifically for warfare against supernatural enemies. These weapons required considerable strength and magical ability to wield effectively, but they would prove essential for Horus's eventual battles with Set's forces. The goddess started her son with smaller training weapons, gradually increasing their size and complexity as his physical development progressed. The 7 scorpions contributed their own expertise to Horus's education, each sharing knowledge gained through centuries of combat experience. Tefen and Befen taught the young god advanced scouting techniques, showing him how to move through hostile territory undetected, while gathering intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. Mestet and Mestetef provided instruction in tactical planning and strategic thinking, using elaborate games and puzzles to develop Horus's ability to anticipate enemy actions and formulate appropriate responses. The years of hiding in the Delta Marshes had transformed Horus from a vulnerable infant into a formidable young god whose divine powers rivaled those of the most ancient deities. His physical form had matured into that of a tall, muscular figure whose falcon-headed appearance commanded immediate respect and instinctive fear from lesser beings. The solar disk that crowned his head blazed with such intensity that mortal eyes could not look upon it directly, while his lunar eye gleamed with the cold wisdom of one who had witnessed the depths of divine treachery. His talons, now capable of rending bronze and iron as easily as papyrus, bore the ceremonial gold bands that marked him as a legitimate claimant to the throne of Egypt. Standing at the edge of the sacred lake that bordered the great temple complex where the gods assembled for their most momentous deliberations, Horus surveyed the magnificent structures that housed the divine court. Massive pylons carved from single blocks of granite rose hundreds of feet into the sky, their surfaces covered with hieroglyphs that recorded the deeds of gods from the dawn of creation. Between these towering monuments stretched courtyards paved with polished obsidian that reflected the movements of celestial bodies, while lotus-shaped columns supported roofs decorated with stars that actually twinkled with captured starlight. The young god's arrival at this sacred precinct marked the culmination of careful planning that had occupied Isis and her allies for months. They had waited for the Festival of the Divine Judgment, a celestial event that occurred once every 77 years, when the cosmic forces aligned to permit the resolution of disputes that affected the fundamental order of creation. During this period, no god could refuse a legitimate challenge to their authority, and all divine beings were compelled to participate in whatever proceedings the assembled court deemed necessary. Horus's formal challenge to Set's rule had been delivered 3 days earlier through an elaborate ritual that involved the sacrifice of a white bull, whose blood was mixed with sacred oils and poured onto an altar dedicated to cosmic justice. The challenge document itself had been inscribed on papyrus made from reeds that grew in the primordial waters of creation, using ink created from ground lapis lazuli, mixed with the tears of Ra himself. The text, written in hieroglyphs that blazed within a fire, formally accused Set of regicide, usurpation, and crimes against the natural order that demanded immediate divine intervention. Set's response had arrived within hours, carried by a messenger whose appearance struck terror into the hearts of even the most courageous gods. The creature stood 8 feet tall with the body of a man but the head of his master's distinctive composite animal, its curved snout dripping with venomous saliva, while its square ears twitched with barely contained aggression. The messenger's skin appeared to be made of hammered copper that reflected light in unsettling patterns, and when it spoke, its voice carried the sound of grinding stone and distant thunder. The Chaos God's reply had been characteristically arrogant and dismissive. Set claimed that his rule over Egypt represented the natural order asserting itself after the weakness and complacency of Osiris's reign. He argued that Horus, as the son of a murdered king, possessed no legitimate claim to power, and that any attempt to challenge the established order would result in the young god's swift and permanent destruction. Most provocatively, Set suggested that Horus's long period of hiding demonstrated cowardice unbecoming of a true ruler, and that his mother's protection had rendered him unfit for the harsh realities of divine kingship. The assembled gods who would serve as judges in the coming contest represented the most ancient and powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Ra, the sun god whose authority superseded even that of kings, occupied the central throne in the Great Hall of Judgment. His appearance combined the majesty of a pharaoh with the terrifying power of the solar disk itself, his golden skin radiating heat that could melt stone while his eyes blazed with the fire that brought life to the world. The god's ceremonial beard, woven with threads of pure sunlight, reached nearly to his feet and moved with its own ethereal breeze. Beside Ra sat Ptah, the creator god whose words had brought the universe into existence through the power of divine speech. His mummified form, wrapped in bandages that sparkled with embedded stars, remained motionless except for his eyes, which tracked every movement in the hall with the attention of one who understood the cosmic significance of each gesture and word. The god's hands, when visible beneath his wrappings, appeared to be crafted from polished obsidian that reflected images of possible futures depending on the decisions made by the assembled court. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and divine scribe, occupied a specially constructed desk that allowed him to record every word spoken during the proceedings. His writing implements included reed pens that had been blessed by every god in the pantheon and ink that would preserve the court's decisions for all eternity. The god's curved beak moved constantly as he muttered calculations and cross-referenced precedents from similar cases that had occurred throughout divine history. His large, intelligent eyes missed nothing, and several times he paused in his writing to fix penetrating stares on speakers, whose words contained hidden meanings or deliberate deceptions. The goddess Neith, whose knowledge of warfare and weaving made her uniquely qualified to judge matters involving both conflict and the threads of fate that connected all beings, sat with her hands resting on a loom, whose threads extended beyond the visible spectrum into realms of possibility that only she could perceive. Her stern expression and battle-scarred armour indicated her impatience with political manoeuvring and her preference for direct action over elaborate debate. The crossed arrows and shield that served as her symbols were not merely decorative, but actual weapons that had been used to maintain cosmic order since the beginning of time. Other members of the Divine Tribunal included Sobek, the crocodile god, whose understanding of primal violence and territorial disputes provided essential perspective on Set's actions, and Seishat, the goddess of libraries and measurement, whose precise knowledge of divine law ensured that all proceedings would follow proper protocol. The assembly also included several minor deities whose specialized knowledge would prove relevant to specific aspects of the case, creating a court whose combined wisdom and experience encompassed virtually every aspect of divine governance and cosmic order. The great hall where these proceedings would unfold had been constructed specifically for occasions when the fundamental order of creation required divine adjudication. The chamber's dimensions followed mathematical principles that ensured perfect acoustics while preventing any participant from using sonic magic to influence the outcome. The floor consisted of alternating squares of white limestone and black granite, arranged in a pattern that created a visual representation of the cosmic balance between order and chaos. Massive columns, carved to resemble palm trees, supported a ceiling decorated with a map of the heavens that moved to reflect the actual positions of stars and planets. The lighting within the hall came from braziers filled with flames that burned without fuel, their colours shifting to reflect the emotional states of the assembled gods. When tensions rose, the flames turned deep red and orange, while moments of contemplation caused them to shift to cooler blues and purples. This visual indicator of the court's collective mood served as a constant reminder that the decisions being made would affect not only the immediate participants, but the entire cosmic order. Horus entered this imposing chamber with the measured pace of one who understood that every gesture would be scrutinized for signs of weakness or uncertainty. His divine regalia included the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, though wearing it in Set's presence constituted a direct challenge to the usurper's authority. The young god's ceremonial kilt, woven from linen so fine it appeared to be made of captured moonbeams, bore the cartouche of Osiris as a reminder of his legitimate lineage. His broad collar, crafted from gold and precious stones arranged in patterns that told the story of his father's murder and his own quest for justice, caught the light from the magical braziers and cast rainbow patterns across the polished floor. Set's entrance provided a stark contrast to his nephew's dignified bearing. The Chaos God burst through the hall's massive doors with such force that the bronze panels, each weighing several tons, flew open and crashed against the walls with sounds like thunder. His composite animal head twisted from side to side as he surveyed the assembled judges, his curved snout curling in expressions of contempt that needed no translation. The god's muscular body, covered in skin that shifted between deep red and black depending on his emotional state, radiated heat that made the air shimmer around him like a desert mirage. The Chaos God's regalia emphasized his dominion over the untamed forces of nature and his rejection of civilized conventions. His crown, if it could be called such, consisted of intertwined serpents whose living bodies writhed constantly while their venomous fangs dripped acids that sizzled when they struck the floor. His collar was made from the scales of primordial monsters, creatures that had existed before the establishment of cosmic order, and each scale bore scars from battles that had shaped the early universe. Rather than the traditional pharaonic kilt, Set wore a garment fashioned from the hide of a creature so ancient that its species had no name, the leather still bearing claw marks from whatever cosmic battle had claimed its life. Ra's voice, when he finally spoke to open the proceedings, carried the authority of one who had witnessed the creation of the universe and whose continued existence maintained the fundamental forces that kept reality from dissolving into primordial chaos. The sun god's words resonated through the hall with such power that the stone walls vibrated in harmony, creating a low humming sound that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. His pronouncement that the court would hear arguments regarding the legitimate succession to Osiris's throne sent visible ripples of energy through the assembled deities, each of whom understood the cosmic implications of the decision they would be required to make. The formal presentation of evidence began with Thoth reading aloud the charges that Horus had brought against his uncle. The ibis-headed god's voice carried no emotional inflection, but the words themselves blazed with righteous fury as he detailed Set's crimes against divine law and natural order. The murder of Osiris was described not merely as fratricide, but as an attack on the fundamental principle that legitimate authority derived from divine appointment rather than violent seizure. The dismemberment of the dead king's body was characterized as an attempt to prevent the natural cycle of death and rebirth that maintained cosmic balance. Set's defense, when his turn came to address the court, demonstrated the cunning and rhetorical skill that had enabled him to maintain power for decades, despite the illegitimate nature of his rule. Rather than denying his role in Osiris's death, the Chaos God argued that his actions had been necessary to prevent the stagnation that threatened to destroy Egyptian civilization under his brother's overly conservative leadership. He claimed that Osiris's devotion to peaceful agriculture and lawful governance had left Egypt vulnerable to external threats and internal decay, requiring a stronger ruler who understood the necessity of controlled violence and strategic chaos. The usurper's arguments contained enough truth to give them persuasive power, as several members of the divine tribunal nodded thoughtfully when he described specific instances where Osiris's gentle nature had prevented him from taking necessary but unpleasant actions. Set spoke eloquently about the need for rulers who could make hard decisions without being paralysed by compassion, and he pointed to his own successful defence of Egypt's borders against foreign invasions as evidence of his superior fitness for kingship. His presentation was masterful in its combination of logical argument and emotional appeal, demonstrating why he had been able to maintain support among certain segments of the divine community. However, Set's defence contained a fatal flaw that Horus was quick to exploit when his turn came to respond. The young god pointed out that his uncle's arguments, even if accepted as valid, provided no justification for the treacherous method used to remove Osiris from power. If Set had genuinely believed that his brother's leadership was inadequate, divine law provided mechanisms for challenging a sitting ruler through formal combat or appeals to the assembled gods. Instead, Set had chosen deception and murder, methods that violated the fundamental principles of honourable conduct that distinguished gods from the chaotic forces they were meant to control. Horus's counter-argument revealed the depth of education he had received during his years of exile, as he cited specific precedents from divine law and quoted from ancient texts that established the proper procedures for succession disputes. His knowledge of legal principles impressed even Thoth, who nodded approvingly as the young god demonstrated mastery of complex theological concepts that many older deities had never fully understood. The precision of Horus's arguments and his obvious familiarity with the intricacies of divine governance effectively countered Set's attempts to portray him as an inexperienced youth unfit for royal responsibility. The first formal test proposed by the Tribunal was a contest of strength that would demonstrate each claimant's ability to defend Egypt against supernatural threats. Ra announced that both gods would be required to lift the Pillar of Heaven, a massive stone column that supported the sky itself and whose weight exceeded that of entire mountain ranges. The pillar had been created during the first days of creation and was inscribed with hieroglyphs that recorded every significant event in cosmic history. Its surface gleamed with a pearl-like luster that suggested the presence of materials not found in the mortal world. Set approached the pillar with characteristic confidence, his muscular form swelling with divine power as he prepared to demonstrate his superior strength. The Chaos God's hands, when he grasped the pillar's base, left smoking impressions in the stone where his supernatural heat had partially melted the sacred material. His initial attempt to lift the massive column resulted in visible strain as his muscles bulged and his composite animal head twisted with effort. Slowly, incredibly, the pillar began to rise from its ancient resting place, the sky above groaning audibly as the fundamental support that had maintained its position for eons was disturbed. The Chaos God managed to lift the pillar to the height of his shoulders before his strength began to fail. Sweat that glowed like molten metal poured from his skin as he struggled to maintain his grip on the increasingly unstable column. The sky above began to sag visibly as its primary support was removed, causing several of the assembled gods to express concern about the wisdom of continuing this particular test. Set's face contorted with rage and frustration as he realized that his strength, while formidable, was insufficient to complete the challenge. With a roar that shook the foundations of the hall, he allowed the pillar to crash back into its original position, the impact sending shock waves through the earth that were felt in the mortal world as earthquakes. Horus approached the same challenge with a different strategy, his keen intelligence suggesting that raw strength alone might not be sufficient to overcome a test designed by the gods themselves. The young god examined the pillar carefully, his falcon eyes detecting subtle variations in the stone's composition and structure that revealed the presence of leverage points and stress concentrations that could be exploited by one who understood the principles of engineering as well as divine power. His hands, when he finally grasped the column, were positioned precisely at points where the stone's internal structure would amplify rather than resist his efforts. The young god's lifting technique combined supernatural strength with mechanical advantage, allowing him to raise the massive pillar with considerably less apparent effort than his uncle had expended. More impressively, Horus managed to lift the column above his head, holding it steady while the sky above remained perfectly stable despite the temporary removal of its primary support. The assembled gods murmured with appreciation as they realized that the young claimant had not merely demonstrated superior strength, but had also shown the wisdom and technical knowledge necessary to accomplish seemingly impossible tasks without causing collateral damage. When Horus gently lowered the pillar back into position, the column settled into its original location with such precision that not even the most sensitive divine instruments could detect any change in its alignment or stability. This demonstration of control impressed the judges even more than the raw display of strength, as it suggested that the young god possessed the careful judgment necessary for wielding power responsibly, rather than simply pursuing maximum dramatic effect. The second test involved a challenge of wisdom that would evaluate each claimant's ability to make complex decisions under pressure, while considering the long-term consequences of their actions. Thoth presented both gods with an intricate scenario involving a dispute between two groups of mortal worshippers, whose conflicting needs appeared to make any resolution impossible without causing significant harm to one faction or the other. The scenario was designed to test not only intellectual capacity, but also moral reasoning and the ability to find creative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Set's response to the wisdom challenge revealed both his intellectual capabilities and the fundamental flaws in his approach to leadership. The Chaos God proposed a solution that involved dividing the disputed territory between the two factions while establishing a system of rotating authority that would prevent either group from gaining permanent dominance over the other. His plan was logically sound and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political dynamics, but it also revealed his assumption that conflict was inevitable and that the best possible outcome was controlled antagonism rather than genuine resolution. Horus offered a radically different approach that addressed the underlying causes of the dispute rather than simply managing its symptoms. The young god proposed establishing a joint council that would include representatives from both factions, along with neutral mediators chosen for their wisdom and impartiality. This council would be tasked with developing long-term solutions that serve the interests of both groups while promoting cooperation rather than competition. His plan required more initial effort and carried greater risks, but it offered the possibility of transforming enemies into allies rather than simply preventing them from destroying each other. The divine judges spent considerable time debating the merits of both approaches, with some arguing that Set's pragmatic realism was more suitable for dealing with the harsh realities of governance, while others contended that Horus's idealistic vision represented the kind of transformative leadership that Egypt needed. The discussion revealed fundamental philosophical differences within the divine community regarding the proper role of authority and the extent to which rulers should attempt to change their subjects rather than simply managing their existing tendencies. The philosophical debates within the divine tribunal reached their crescendo when Ra declared that words alone could not determine the rightful ruler of Egypt. The sun god's pronouncement that physical combat would settle the succession dispute sent tremors through the assembled deities, each understanding that the coming battles would reshape the cosmic order itself. The great hall's magical braziers flared with crimson flames as divine tension reached unprecedented levels, while the star map ceiling began displaying constellations associated with war and transformation. Set's reaction to the combat decree was immediate and terrifying. The Chaos God's composite animal head threw back in a roar that shattered several of the hall's massive windows, sending crystalline fragments raining down like deadly snow. His muscular form began to swell with accumulated rage and supernatural power, the red and black patterns on his skin shifting into configurations that hurt mortal eyes to observe directly. The temperature around Set rose dramatically, causing the polished obsidian floor to crack beneath his feet, while the air shimmered with heat distortions that made his outline appear to blur and multiply. Horus maintained his composure despite the overwhelming display of his uncle's fury, though his own divine nature responded instinctively to the challenge. The young god's solar eye blazed brighter, while his lunar eye grew cold as winter starlight, creating a visual representation of the balanced forces he embodied. His talons extended slightly from their sheaths, the golden bands around them beginning to glow with protective magic that his mother had woven into the metal during his childhood. The falcon disc above his head rotated slowly, its edges sharp enough to slice through divine flesh should the need arise. The first combat would take place in the aerial realm, where both gods could utilize their supernatural abilities without the constraints imposed by terrestrial physics. Ra opened a dimensional gateway that led to a vast sky realm, suspended between the mortal world and the celestial sphere, a space where divine beings could engage in full combat without risking damage to the earth below. This aerial battlefield stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, its boundaries marked by walls of crystallized wind that prevented combatants from fleeing beyond the designated combat zone. The Sky Realm's atmosphere differed significantly from that of the mortal world, containing currents of pure magical energy that could be manipulated by skilled aerial fighters. These ethereal winds appeared as streams of coloured light that flowed in complex patterns throughout the combat space, some providing lift and acceleration to those who could harness them, while others created turbulent zones capable of disorienting even the most experienced flyers. The realm's floor consisted of solidified clouds that could support weight but yielded like soft sand when struck with sufficient force, ensuring that falls would not prove immediately fatal while still allowing for dramatic impacts. Set's transformation for aerial combat revealed the true extent of his shape-shifting abilities. The Chaos God's humanoid form dissolved into a writhing mass of shadow and flame before reconstituting itself as a gigantic falcon whose wingspan exceeded 200 feet. However, this was no ordinary bird of prey but a nightmarish hybrid that combined avian characteristics with features drawn from his desert domain. The creature's feathers appeared to be crafted from hammered copper that reflected light in disturbing patterns, while its beak curved into a weapon capable of crushing stone. Most unsettling were its eyes, which retained Set's original composite animal features, creating a predatory gaze that seemed to look in multiple directions simultaneously. The transformed Set's talons bore resemblance to those of no earthly creature, combining the grasping power of an eagle with the crushing strength of a crocodile and the venomous properties of a serpent. Each digit ended in a claw that dripped with acids capable of dissolving divine flesh, while the scales that covered his legs pulsed with internal heat that could sear opponents through mere contact. His tail, rather than the simple fan of feathers typical of raptors, consisted of multiple appendages that moved independently like serpents, each tipped with barbed stingers that could inject paralyzing toxins. Horus's aerial form represented the perfection of falcon evolution, guided by divine will rather than natural selection. His transformation maintained the classic proportions of his earthly counterparts, while scaling up to match Set's intimidating size, creating a creature that embodied grace and power in equal measure. The young god's feathers gleamed with metallic luster that shifted between gold and silver depending on the angle of observation, while his eyes retained their distinctive solar and lunar characteristics even in his transformed state. His beak, though smaller than Set's massive weapon, was crafted from materials harder than diamond and sharp enough to penetrate any known substance. The contrast between the two aerial combatants could not have been more striking. Set's form radiated chaotic energy that caused the magical wind currents to twist into violent eddies around him, creating a zone of turbulence that extended for miles in every direction. His flight pattern was aggressive and unpredictable, with sudden changes in direction and altitude that defied conventional understanding of aerodynamics. The Chaos God's wings beat with irregular rhythms that generated sonic booms capable of stunning smaller creatures, while his multiple tail appendages lashed constantly as if seeking targets to strike. Horus moved through the aerial realm with fluid precision that made his massive size appear almost weightless. The young god's flight path followed elegant curves that took advantage of the magical wind currents rather than fighting against them, allowing him to achieve tremendous speeds with minimal energy expenditure. His wing beats created harmonious sounds that resonated with the realm's natural frequencies, generating lift and propulsion through acoustic manipulation rather than brute force. The solar disk above his head continued to rotate even in his transformed state, creating gyroscopic stability that enhanced his maneuverability. The initial engagement between the two divine falcons began with a series of high-speed passes designed to test each other's reflexes and defensive capabilities. Set attacked with the fury of a desert sandstorm, his massive form diving from tremendous heights, while his serpentine tail appendages lashed out in coordinated strikes aimed at Horus's vital areas. The Chaos God's acidic talons left glowing trails in the air as he swept past his nephew, each near miss dissolving portions of the crystallized wind barriers that marked the combat zone's boundaries. Horus responded to these attacks with defensive maneuvers that showcased his superior understanding of aerial dynamics. Rather than meeting Set's charges head-on, the young god used the magical wind currents to execute complex evasive patterns that caused his uncle's strikes to miss by margins so narrow that observers could barely perceive the separation. His counterattacks were precisely timed to exploit the brief moments when Set's momentum carried him past optimal striking position, allowing Horus to rake his diamond-hard talons across his opponent's copper-scaled hide. The first significant wound of the battle occurred when Horus managed to execute a maneuver that brought him directly above Set during one of the Chaos God's diving attacks. The young falcon's talons found gaps in his uncle's metallic plumage, penetrating deep enough to draw divine ichor that sparkled with internal fire as it fell toward the cloud floor below. Set's roar of pain and rage shattered several of the magical wind currents, creating temporary dead zones where neither combatant could maintain stable flight. Set's retaliation came in the form of a devastating sonic attack that utilized his composite animal head's unique vocal capabilities. The Chaos God's roar combined the threatening calls of multiple predatory species into a weapon that could disorient opponents and disrupt their magical abilities. The sound waves struck Horus with physical force, comparable to a battering ram, sending the young god tumbling through the air, while his enhanced hearing struggled to process the cacophonous assault. Several of Horus's primary flight feathers were torn loose by the sonic blast, reducing his maneuverability and forcing him to rely more heavily on magical levitation. The aerial combat continued for hours, with both combatants sustaining numerous wounds that would have proven fatal to lesser beings. Set's copper feathers became increasingly tarnished as Horus's precise strikes found their marks, while several of his tail appendages hung useless after being severed by his nephew's razor-sharp beak. The Chaos God's acidic blood had begun to eat through his own plumage in several places, creating weak points that Horus exploited with ruthless efficiency. Horus bore his own collection of battle damage, including deep gashes across his breast where Set's venomous claws had found their mark and a partially damaged wing membrane that forced him to compensate through increased magical energy expenditure. Most concerning was a growing weakness in his left eye, the lunar orb having been struck by one of Set's sonic attacks, and now flickering irregularly like a candle in a strong wind. The decisive moment of the aerial battle came when Set attempted to execute a maneuver that would have allowed him to strike at Horus's vulnerable neck area. The Chaos God folded his massive wings and entered a controlled dive that built tremendous speed, his multiple tail appendages spread wide to prevent his target from escaping to either side. However, Horus had anticipated this attack pattern and had positioned himself to take advantage of Set's commitment to a single trajectory. As Set reached maximum velocity in his dive, Horus executed a complex barrel roll that brought him directly into his uncle's flight path, while presenting his own talons at the optimal angle for a devastating counterstrike. The collision between the two divine falcons created a thunderclap that was heard across multiple dimensions, while the impact sent both combatants spinning toward the cloud floor in a tangle of wings, talons, and serpentine appendages. Set struck the solidified clouds first, his greater mass driving him deep into the yielding surface while his copper feathers scattered like metallic rain. Horus landed moments later, his more controlled descent allowing him to maintain better positioning despite his own injuries. The young god's solar eye blazed with triumph as he prepared to deliver what appeared to be a finishing blow to his stunned uncle. However, Set's apparent defeat proved to be an elaborate deception. The Chaos God had used his impact with the cloud floor to trigger a transformation that dissolved his falcon form and reconstituted his divine essence as a massive hippopotamus whose hide was armoured with the same copper scales that had protected his aerial form. This new shape was perfectly adapted for combat on the yielding cloud surface, with broad feet that distributed weight effectively and a jaw capable of crushing opponents with hydraulic force. The hippopotamus form that Set had assumed represented one of the most dangerous creatures in the Egyptian bestiary, an animal whose deceptively placid appearance concealed tremendous strength and unpredictable aggression. Divine enhancement had amplified these natural characteristics to supernatural levels, creating a creature whose bite could sever divine limbs and whose charge could flatten stone walls. The copper scales that covered Set's new form had arranged themselves into overlapping patterns that provided comprehensive protection while allowing full freedom of movement. Horus found himself at a significant disadvantage against this new opponent, as his falcon form was poorly suited for ground combat against such a massive adversary. The young god's attempts to maintain aerial superiority were frustrated by Set's ability to leap tremendous distances, his powerful hind legs launching his multi-ton bulk through the air with surprising speed and accuracy. Several of these jumping attacks came close to connecting, forcing Horus to expend increasing amounts of energy on evasive maneuvers. The hippopotamus Set's primary weapon was his enormous jaw, which could open wide enough to engulf Horus's entire torso, while delivering crushing force measured in tons per square inch. The Chaos God's teeth had been enhanced beyond their natural proportions, becoming tusk-like weapons that could pierce divine flesh and inject venom that caused temporary paralysis. His massive bulk also served as a weapon, as charges and body slams could inflict devastating damage on opponents unable to avoid his attacks. Recognizing that his current form was inadequate for this phase of combat, Horus initiated his own transformation sequence. The young god's falcon shape dissolved into streams of golden light that swirled around the battlefield before coalescing into a new form, specifically chosen to counter Set's hippopotamus configuration. Horus emerged from the transformation as a divine crocodile, whose length exceeded 60 feet, and whose hide gleamed with the same metallic properties that had protected his falcon form. The crocodile form provided Horus with several advantages in combat against Set's hippopotamus shape. His elongated body could coil around opponents to restrict their movement, while his powerful tail served as both weapon and propulsion system. Most importantly, his massive jaws were equipped with teeth designed specifically for gripping and tearing, allowing him to maintain holds on opponents while inflicting continuous damage through his bite. The transformation also granted him enhanced mobility in aquatic environments, should the battle move to that terrain. The clash between the divine hippopotamus and the sacred crocodile created shock waves that rippled through the cloud floor, causing sections of the aerial battlefield to collapse into lower dimensional spaces. Set's initial charge was met by Horus's defensive posture, the crocodile's low profile and superior leverage allowing him to redirect his uncle's momentum while simultaneously striking with his own formidable weapons. The hippopotamus's copper-scaled hide proved resistant to conventional crocodilian attacks, but Horus's divine nature allowed his teeth to find purchase in the gaps between his opponent's protective scales. The combat between these two massive creatures devolved into a brutal wrestling match that tested the limits of divine endurance. Set's hippopotamus form possessed superior raw strength, allowing him to break free from Horus's initial grappling attempts through sheer muscular power. However, the crocodile's superior flexibility and longer reach enabled Horus to maintain contact with his opponent while avoiding the most dangerous aspects of Set's counterattacks. Both combatants sustained serious injuries during this phase of the battle. Set's hippopotamus hide bore numerous puncture wounds, where Horus's teeth had penetrated his armoured scales, while several of his ribs had been cracked by the crocodile's powerful, constricting coils. Horus had suffered damage to his tail from Set's crushing bite, reducing his mobility and forcing him to rely more heavily on his jaw strength to maintain advantageous positions. The ground combat reached its climax when both gods simultaneously attempted finishing moves that left them vulnerable to counterattacks. Set opened his massive jaws to their fullest extent while lunging forward to engulf Horus's head. But the crocodile god twisted at the last moment and clamped his own jaws around his uncle's throat. The resulting stalemate left both combatants unable to release their holds without exposing themselves to devastating retaliation. Ra's intervention came at the moment when it appeared that both gods might inflict fatal wounds upon each other simultaneously. The sun god's voice boomed across the aerial battlefield, commanding an immediate cessation of hostilities before the combat could result in the permanent destruction of either participant. The divine judges had observed enough to evaluate both combatants' fighting abilities, and continuing the battle served no useful purpose given the escalating risk of casualties that would destabilize the cosmic order. The separation of the two locked combatants required careful coordination from several members of the Divine Tribunal. Thoth used his knowledge of anatomy to identify pressure points that would force both gods to release their grips, while Ptah employed his creative powers to generate barriers that prevented immediate renewed attacks. The process took considerable time and effort, as both Set and Horus had to overcome their combat instincts and divine nature's compulsion to fight until victory was achieved. When the gods finally returned to their humanoid forms, the extent of their injuries became apparent to the assembled judges. Set's throat bore deep puncture wounds that leaked divine ichor in steady streams, while his composite animal head showed signs of severe trauma from Horus's crushing bite. The Chaos God's movements had become noticeably laboured, suggesting internal injuries that would require considerable time to heal properly. Horus's condition was equally concerning, with his left eye now completely dark and unresponsive to magical healing attempts. The lunar orb that had provided him with night vision and enhanced perception had been permanently damaged during the aerial phase of combat, creating a disability that would affect his capabilities in future confrontations. Additionally, several of his ribs had been fractured by Set's hippopotamus bite, causing him visible pain despite his attempts to maintain a dignified bearing. The Divine Tribunal's reaction to the aerial and ground combat was mixed, with different judges drawing varying conclusions about what they had witnessed. Some members praised both combatants for their skill and determination, while others expressed concern about the level of violence that had been displayed. The inconclusive nature of the physical combat meant that additional tests would be required to determine the rightful successor to Osiris's throne. Neith proposed that the next phase of the contest should involve a demonstration of leadership skills rather than purely physical capabilities. The goddess suggested a boat race on the sacred Nile, where both claimants would be required to navigate treacherous waters while commanding crews of lesser deities. This test would evaluate their ability to inspire loyalty, make tactical decisions under pressure, and demonstrate the kind of practical skills necessary for governing a realm dependent on river navigation. The boat race proposal gained immediate support from several tribunal members who recognized that kingship required more than combat prowess. Sobek endorsed the concept enthusiastically, noting that control of the Nile represented the fundamental basis of Egyptian civilization and that any legitimate ruler must demonstrate mastery over the river's divine essence. Seychat added her support based on the race's potential to test mathematical and navigational skills that would prove essential for effective governance. Set's response to the boat race challenge revealed his confidence in his own abilities, while simultaneously demonstrating his contempt for what he perceived as his nephew's inexperience. The Chaos God boasted that his knowledge of the Nile's hidden currents and dangerous passages far exceeded that of any other deity, having spent centuries exploring the river's most remote and perilous sections. His familiarity with the creatures that inhabited the waterway's depths would provide him with advantages that Horus could not hope to match. The young god's acceptance of the boat race challenge was delivered with quiet confidence that impressed several members of the divine tribunal. Horus acknowledged his uncle's greater experience, while pointing out that the contest would be decided by more than mere familiarity with river conditions. Leadership, tactical thinking, and the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances would prove equally important, qualities that he believed his divine heritage and careful education had prepared him to demonstrate. The divine tribunal's attention shifted from the inconclusive combat results to examining the specific injuries both combatants had sustained, particularly the alarming damage to Horus's left eye. The lunar orb, which had provided the young god with enhanced night vision and mystical perception since birth, now appeared as a lifeless sphere of dulled silver that reflected no light and responded to no magical stimulus. The injury represented more than mere physical damage. It constituted a fundamental disruption of the cosmic balance that Horus embodied as the living representation of both solar and lunar forces. Thoth approached the wounded god with the careful attention of one whose understanding of anatomy extended far beyond the physical realm into the metaphysical structures that govern divine existence. The ibis-headed god's examination revealed that Set's sonic attack during their aerial combat had not simply damaged the eye's surface, but had actually severed several of the ethereal connections that linked the organ to the celestial bodies it represented. These mystical pathways, invisible to ordinary perception, carried the essential energies that allowed Horus to channel lunar power and maintain his role as a bridge between day and night cycles. The damage assessment proved more complex than initially apparent. While the eye's physical structure remained intact, the delicate network of magical conduits that channeled moonlight into divine power had been shattered like crystalline fibres struck by a hammer. The disruption extended beyond the immediate injury site, affecting Horus's overall magical balance and creating cascading effects throughout his divine essence. His solar eye began burning more intensely to compensate for the loss, but this increased activity threatened to destabilize his entire supernatural matrix. Set observed his nephew's examination with barely concealed satisfaction, though he attempted to maintain an expression of neutral concern appropriate for the formal proceedings. The Chaos God understood that the eye injury represented a significant strategic advantage, as Horus's reduced magical capacity would handicap him in future contests, while simultaneously undermining his symbolic authority as a balanced deity. The lunar eye's darkness created a visible flaw that Set's supporters could point to as evidence of the young god's incomplete divine nature. The assembled judges recognized the severity of the situation and its implications for the succession dispute. A partially blinded claimant to the throne would face questions about his ability to perceive threats and opportunities with the clarity required for effective leadership. More troubling was the symbolic dimension of the injury. The darkened lunar eye suggested that cosmic order itself had been disrupted, potentially indicating divine displeasure with Horus's challenge to Set's established rule. Isis, who had been observing the proceedings from the gallery, reserved for non-participating deities, requested permission to address the tribunal regarding her son's condition. The goddess's knowledge of healing magic surpassed that of most other divine beings, and her intimate familiarity with Horus's unique physiological structure made her the most qualified candidate to attempt a restoration. However, Her obvious bias as the injured god's mother raised questions about whether her involvement would compromise the contest's fairness. Ra's decision to allow Isis to examine her son reflected the sun god's understanding that the eye injury transcended the immediate succession dispute. The damage to Horus's lunar eye threatened to disrupt the fundamental cosmic balance that required both solar and lunar forces to function in harmony. If left untreated, the injury could create instabilities that affected not only the divine realm, but also the mortal world's natural cycles and magical systems. Isis's initial assessment confirmed Thoth's findings, while revealing additional complications that the wisdom god's examination had not detected. The severance of ethereal pathways had created a form of magical infection that was slowly spreading through Horus's divine essence, threatening to corrupt his solar eye as well. The goddess recognized that conventional healing techniques would prove inadequate for addressing damage that existed primarily in non-physical dimensions, requiring innovative approaches that combined multiple schools of magical theory. The healing process that Isis proposed involved reconstructing the damaged ethereal pathways, using materials and techniques that had never been attempted on such a scale. She would need to harvest moonlight directly from the lunar sphere during specific celestial alignments, then weave this captured radiance into new conduits that could replace the severed connections. The procedure carried significant risks, as failure could result in complete blindness, or even more severe damage to Horus's divine matrix. Thoth volunteered to assist in the healing effort, recognizing that his expertise in magical theory and precise spell construction would be essential for success. The wisdom god's knowledge of divine anatomy, combined with his experience in creating and modifying magical systems, made him uniquely qualified to help design the complex rituals required for ethereal pathway reconstruction. His participation also provided the healing effort with official sanction from the Divine Tribunal, ensuring that the procedure would not be viewed as outside interference in the succession contest. The preparation for Horus's eye restoration required several days, during which the Divine Tribunal suspended formal proceedings to allow for the necessary celestial alignments. The healing chamber that Isis and Thoth constructed within the temple complex incorporated architectural elements designed to focus and amplify lunar energies, while providing protection from the chaotic influences that Set's presence generated throughout the sacred precinct. The chamber's walls were lined with polished silver that had been blessed by every moon deity in the Egyptian pantheon, creating surfaces that could capture and concentrate even the faintest traces of lunar radiance. The ritual implements required for the healing ceremony included several items that had never been used in combination before. Isis gathered water from the primordial ocean that existed before creation, its properties unchanged since the dawn of time and therefore capable of serving as a medium for the most fundamental forms of magical working. Thoth contributed reed pens that had been used to record the original laws of cosmic order, their surfaces imbued with the authority to rewrite even the most fundamental aspects of divine nature. The centerpiece of the healing setup was a crystalline lens that had been carved from a single piece of meteoric glass, its surface polished to optical perfection and inscribed with hieroglyphs that described the mathematical relationships governing celestial mechanics. This lens would focus the captured moonlight into concentrated beams, capable of reconstructing the damaged ethereal pathways with surgical precision. The artifact's creation had required the combined efforts of multiple craftsman deities working under Ptah's direct supervision. Set's reaction to the healing preparations revealed his growing concern about the potential restoration of his nephew's full power. The Chaos God attempted to raise procedural objections to the healing effort, arguing that divine contests should be conducted with participants maintaining whatever injuries they had sustained during legitimate combat. His position had some merit within traditional interpretations of divine law, but the cosmic implications of leaving Horus's lunar eye damaged ultimately overrode concerns about contest fairness. The healing ceremony began during the darkest phase of the new moon, when lunar energies were at their most concentrated and malleable state. Isis positioned herself at the chamber's eastern wall, while Thoth took his place at the western boundary, their combined magical fields creating a stable framework within which the delicate restoration work could proceed. Horus lay motionless on a platform constructed from materials that had never been touched by sunlight, his damaged eye exposed to the focused moonbeams that streamed through the crystalline lens. The initial phase of the healing process involved carefully removing the corrupted ethereal pathways that had been damaged beyond repair. Isis used surgical instruments crafted from crystallized starlight to excise the infected magical conduits, while Thoth monitored the patient's overall divine essence for signs of systemic instability. Each severed pathway released bursts of chaotic energy that had to be contained and neutralized before they could spread to healthy areas of Horus's magical matrix. The reconstruction of new ethereal pathways required unprecedented precision and timing. Isis wove strands of concentrated moonlight into complex patterns that replicated the original conduit structure, while incorporating improvements designed to prevent similar damage in future combat situations. The goddess's fingers moved with the speed and accuracy of a master weaver working on a loom, each motion guided by mathematical calculations that Thoth provided through whispered instructions. The most challenging aspect of the healing process involved re-establishing the connections between the reconstructed pathways and the celestial sources that powered them. These links existed in dimensions that intersected with, but remained distinct from normal space-time, requiring the healers to extend their consciousness into realms where conventional logic and causality operated according to different principles. The strain of maintaining awareness across multiple dimensional boundaries pushed both Isis and Thoth to the limits of their considerable abilities. As the healing progressed, Horus's damaged eye began to show signs of returning function. The dulled silver surface gradually acquired the lustrous quality characteristic of healthy lunar orbs, while faint traces of mystical energy began flowing through the newly constructed ethereal pathways. However, the restoration process also revealed that the eye's capabilities had been fundamentally altered by the reconstruction, gaining new properties that had not existed in its original configuration. The reconstructed lunar eye possessed enhanced sensitivity to magical emanations, allowing Horus to perceive supernatural phenomena that remained invisible to other deities. This improvement came at the cost of some traditional lunar functions, as the eye's connection to natural moon cycles had been weakened during the reconstruction process. The trade-off represented a net gain in overall capability, but it also meant that Horus's divine nature had been permanently changed by his injury and subsequent healing. The completion of the eye restoration ceremony coincided with the rising of the full moon, whose radiance streamed through the crystalline lens with unprecedented intensity. The concentrated lunar energy activated the newly constructed ethereal pathways all at once, causing Horus's restored eye to blaze with silver fire that illuminated the entire healing chamber. The young god's gasp of relief and wonder confirmed that the procedure had succeeded beyond even Isis's optimistic projections. Thoth's examination of the healed eye revealed that the reconstruction had created something entirely new in divine physiology. The enhanced lunar orb now functioned as both a sensory organ and a magical focusing device, capable of channeling lunar energies with greater precision and power than the original eye had possessed. The wisdom god documented these changes meticulously, recognizing that they represented a significant evolution in divine anatomy that would influence future healing techniques. The symbolic implications of Horus's eye restoration extended far beyond the immediate medical success. The reconstructed lunar orb glowed with a radiance that seemed to pulse in harmony with cosmic rhythms, creating visual patterns that suggested the restoration of proper balance between solar and lunar forces. The eye's enhanced capabilities also demonstrated that divine nature could evolve and improve through adversity, a concept that challenged traditional assumptions about the fixed nature of godhood. Set's response to his nephew's successful healing revealed the depth of his frustration and growing desperation. The chaos god had counted on Horus's permanent disability to provide him with lasting advantages in their ongoing contest, and the complete restoration of his opponent's capabilities forced him to reconsider his strategic approach. The enhanced properties of the reconstructed eye actually left Horus more formidable than before his injury, transforming what Set had intended as a crippling blow into an inadvertent strengthening of his rival. The Divine Tribunal's reaction to the healing ceremony was uniformly positive, with several judges expressing amazement at the innovative techniques that Isis and Thoth had developed. The successful reconstruction of damaged ethereal pathways opened new possibilities for treating injuries that had previously been considered permanent, while the enhanced capabilities of Horus's restored eye suggested that divine evolution could occur through guided healing processes rather than only through natural development. Ra's pronouncement that the succession contest could resume with both participants restored to full health was met with approval from most tribunal members, though some expressed concern about the implications of Horus's enhanced abilities. The young god's improved magical perception could provide him with significant advantages in future tests, potentially creating an imbalance that favoured him as much as his previous injury had handicapped him. However, the cosmic necessity of maintaining proper solar-lunar balance ultimately took precedence over concerns about contest fairness. The restored eye's first demonstration of its enhanced capabilities occurred during the Tribunal's preparation for the next phase of testing. Horus's lunar orb detected subtle magical emanations from several supposedly neutral observers, revealing that Set had positioned disguised agents throughout the temple complex to gather intelligence and potentially interfere with the proceedings. The discovery of this spy network prompted a comprehensive security review that uncovered additional evidence of the Chaos God's attempts to manipulate the contest through covert means. The enhanced eye's ability to perceive magical signatures also revealed previously hidden aspects of the Divine Tribunal members themselves. Horus could now observe the complex webs of power and influence that connected the various judges, seeing alliance patterns and potential biases that had been invisible during earlier proceedings. This new level of awareness provided him with valuable insights into the political dynamics that would influence the Tribunal's final decisions, though he was careful not to reveal the full extent of his enhanced perceptions. The mathematical precision required for the eye's reconstruction had created an unexpected side effect that Thoth found particularly fascinating. The restored organ now functioned according to geometric principles that allowed it to calculate complex magical equations instantaneously, effectively turning Horus's enhanced perception into a form of supernatural mathematics processor. This capability would prove invaluable for tasks requiring precise magical manipulation or the analysis of complex mystical phenomena. The symbolic significance of the Eye of Horus began to manifest even before the succession contest concluded. Divine artisans throughout the celestial realm started incorporating representations of the restored eye into protective amulets and ceremonial objects, recognizing its power as a symbol of healing, restoration, and enhanced perception. The eye's distinctive appearance, with its combination of natural lunar radiance and artificial enhancement patterns, created a visual icon that would resonate with both divine and mortal populations. Human priests in the mortal world reported receiving visions of the restored eye during their meditation practices, suggesting that the healing ceremony had created ripple effects that extended across dimensional boundaries. These visions typically depicted the eye as a source of protection and wisdom, capable of seeing through deceptions and illusions, while providing guidance to those who sought truth and justice. The consistency of these reports across widely separated temple communities indicated that the eye's symbolic power was already beginning to influence mortal religious practices. The fractional symbolism that would later become associated with the Eye of Horus began to emerge during the healing process itself. Thoth's mathematical analysis of the Reconstruction revealed that each component of the restored eye corresponded to specific fractions that, when combined, represented perfect wholeness and completion. The eyebrow represented 1/8, the pupil 1/4, the white of the eye 1/2, and so forth, with the complete eye symbolizing the unity that emerged from the proper combination of distinct parts. This mathematical symbolism reflected the broader cosmic principles that govern divine healing and restoration. Just as the eye's fractional components had to be perfectly aligned to create functional vision, the various aspects of cosmic order required precise balance and proportion to maintain universal harmony. The successful reconstruction of Horus's eye thus served as both a practical healing achievement and a demonstration of the mathematical principles that underlie all successful magical workings. The enhanced eye's protective capabilities became apparent when Set attempted to launch a surprise magical attack during one of the Tribunal's recess periods. The Chaos God's assault, which should have caught Horus completely off guard, was detected by the lunar orb several seconds before it arrived, providing enough warning for the young god to deploy appropriate defences. The attack's failure not only demonstrated the eye's defensive value but also revealed Set's willingness to violate the formal protocols governing divine contests. Ra's fury at this breach of divine law manifested as solar flares that scorched the temple's outer walls, while his voice carried the authority of cosmic justice when he commanded the immediate convening of the full Aeneid for final judgment. The 9 great gods who comprised this supreme tribunal had witnessed enough evidence through the various contests and challenges to render their ultimate decision regarding the succession dispute. The time for physical trials and magical demonstrations had passed. Now came the moment when divine law, precedent, and cosmic necessity would determine Egypt's rightful ruler. The Great Hall of Judgment underwent a dramatic transformation as preparations began for the climactic trial. The magical braziers that had provided illumination during previous proceedings were replaced with eternal flames that burned with the pure essence of truth itself, their light revealing hidden meanings and exposing deceptions with merciless clarity. The star map ceiling expanded to display not only current celestial positions, but also the historical configurations that had presided over significant moments in divine history, creating a visual record of cosmic precedent that would guide the tribunal's deliberations. Thoth supervised the installation of the Scales of Ma'at, a divine artifact that could weigh the moral and legal merit of arguments with absolute precision. These scales, crafted from materials that existed before the creation of physical matter, responded not to the weight of objects, but to the fundamental truth value of statements and claims presented before them. The scales' golden pans hung from chains of crystallized time, their surfaces inscribed with hieroglyphs that recorded every significant legal decision made since the establishment of cosmic order. The seating arrangement for the final tribunal reflected the complex hierarchies and relationships that governed divine society. Ra occupied the central throne, his position as supreme solar deity granting him ultimate authority over the proceedings, while his role as creator of many other gods provided him with intimate knowledge of their capabilities and limitations. To his right sat Shu, god of air and atmosphere, whose domain encompassed the space between earth and sky where divine and mortal realms intersected. His testimony would prove crucial for understanding how the succession decision would affect the practical governance of Egypt. Tefnut, goddess of moisture and divine order, took her place to Ra's left, her presence serving as a reminder that cosmic balance required the harmonious interaction of complementary forces rather than the dominance of any single principle. Her relationship with Shu as both sister and wife provided her with unique insights into the complex family dynamics that had created the current crisis, while her role in maintaining atmospheric stability made her acutely aware of how divine conflicts affected the natural world. Geb, the earth god whose body formed the physical foundation of Egypt itself, occupied a throne carved from a single massive emerald that pulsed with the heartbeat of the land. His testimony would address the practical consequences of the succession dispute for Egypt's agricultural productivity, mineral resources, and geological stability. The god's intimate connection to the soil that sustained human civilization made him particularly sensitive to the ways that divine governance affected mortal welfare. Nut, goddess of the sky whose star-spangled body arched over the earth in eternal embrace, presided from a throne that appeared to float unsupported above the other seats. Her perspective encompassed the vast cosmic cycles that governed stellar movements, seasonal changes, and the fundamental rhythms that regulated all existence. Her testimony would place the immediate succession dispute within the broader context of cosmic time and universal order. Nephthys, sister to both Isis and Set, occupied perhaps the most difficult position among the tribunal members. Her family relationships created potential conflicts of interest that she would need to navigate carefully while maintaining her reputation for impartial judgment. As goddess of the boundaries between life and death, her insights into the cosmic implications of Osiris's murder and resurrection would prove essential for understanding the full scope of Set's crimes against natural order. The final two members of the Aeneid brought specialized knowledge that would prove crucial for the tribunal's decision. Ptah, the creator god whose words had brought the universe into existence, possessed unparalleled understanding of the fundamental principles that govern divine authority and legitimate succession. His testimony would address the theological foundations of kingship and the cosmic mandate that distinguish rightful rulers from mere usurpers. Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, and divine motherhood, represented the nurturing aspects of royal authority that balanced the more aggressive elements embodied by warrior deities. Her perspective would address the qualities necessary for effective leadership and the ways that different approaches to governance affected the welfare of both divine and mortal subjects. The formal presentation of evidence began with Thoth's comprehensive review of all testimony, physical contests, and magical demonstrations that occurred during the extended proceedings. The wisdom god's perfect memory and absolute accuracy ensured that no detail would be overlooked or misrepresented, as the tribunal considered the full scope of evidence available to them. His recitation took several hours, during which the assembled gods maintained complete silence while absorbing the complex web of facts, precedents, and interpretations that would guide their final decision. Set's final argument before the Aeneid demonstrated both his rhetorical skill and his fundamental misunderstanding of divine justice. The chaos god presented himself as a necessary force for preventing the stagnation that threatened to destroy Egyptian civilization under weak or overly compassionate leadership. He argued that his harsh methods, while regrettable, had proven effective in maintaining Egypt's security and prosperity during his decades of rule. His supporters among the minor deities nodded approvingly as he described specific instances where decisive action had prevented disasters that more gentle approaches might have failed to address. The Chaos God's presentation included detailed accounts of military victories he had achieved against foreign invaders, economic policies that had increased Egypt's wealth, and administrative reforms that had improved the efficiency of divine governance. His supporters had prepared elaborate visual aids that displayed statistical evidence of Egypt's growth and development during his reign, creating a compelling case for the practical benefits of his leadership style. Set's argument concluded with the assertion that divine succession should be determined by demonstrated competence, rather than mere hereditary claims. However, Set's defense contained several critical weaknesses that Horus was prepared to exploit. The young god's response focused not on disputing his uncle's achievements, but on exposing the illegitimate methods through which those achievements had been obtained. Horus pointed out that Set's military victories had been won through the use of deceptive tactics that violated divine codes of honourable combat, while his economic successes had come at the expense of Egypt's long-term stability and the welfare of its most vulnerable populations. The most damaging aspect of Horus's counter-argument addressed the fundamental violation of cosmic order that Set's usurpation represented. The young god cited specific passages from the ancient texts that established the principle of legitimate succession, demonstrating that divine authority derived not from personal capability alone, but from the proper alignment with cosmic forces that maintained universal harmony. Set's murder of Osiris had disrupted these forces in ways that continued to generate instability throughout both divine and mortal realms. Horus's presentation included testimony from various supernatural entities who had observed the effects of Set's rule on the natural world. River spirits reported that the Nile's floods had become increasingly unpredictable since Osiris's death, while desert jinn described expanding zones of lifeless wasteland that appeared wherever Set's influence grew too strong. These testimonies painted a picture of gradual environmental degradation that contradicted Set's claims of successful governance. The young god's argument reached its crescendo with a detailed analysis of divine law that demonstrated the cosmic necessity of legitimate succession. He showed how Set's usurpation had created a fundamental imbalance between order and chaos that threatened to destabilize the entire universe if left uncorrected. The restoration of proper succession would not only address the immediate injustice of Osiris's murder, but would also realign the cosmic forces necessary for maintaining universal harmony. The divine testimonies that followed provided crucial insights into the complex political dynamics that influenced the Tribunal's deliberations. Sobek, despite his natural affinity for Set's aggressive nature, testified that the Chaos God's rule had disrupted the delicate ecological balance of the Nile Delta, causing unprecedented conflicts between different species of aquatic life. The Crocodile God's testimony carried particular weight because his support for Set had been expected, making his criticism of the Chaos God's environmental policies especially damaging. Seishat's testimony addressed the administrative aspects of divine governance that often received less attention than military or magical capabilities. The goddess of libraries and measurement had maintained detailed records of both God's performance in various tests and challenges, providing statistical analysis that revealed significant patterns in their decision-making processes. Her data showed that while Set excelled in situations requiring immediate decisive action, Horus demonstrated superior performance in complex scenarios that required careful consideration of long-term consequences. Neith's contribution to the proceedings carried special authority due to her reputation for absolute impartiality and her expertise in matters involving divine warfare. The goddess's analysis of the combat trials revealed that while both contestants had demonstrated formidable fighting abilities, their approaches to violence differed in ways that had important implications for their fitness as rulers. Set's combat style emphasized overwhelming force and intimidation tactics that could achieve quick victories but often created lasting resentment among defeated opponents. Horus's fighting techniques, by contrast, showed a preference for precise, targeted applications of force that achieved necessary objectives while minimizing collateral damage and preserving opportunities for eventual reconciliation with former enemies. Neith's testimony suggested that these different approaches reflected fundamental differences in how the two gods understood the relationship between power and responsibility, with Horus demonstrating greater awareness of the long-term consequences of violent action. The magical proofs presented during the final proceedings included several demonstrations that had been prepared specifically for the Tribunal's consideration. Isis, despite her obvious bias as Horus's mother, was permitted to present evidence regarding the cosmic disruptions that had occurred since Set's usurpation of the throne. Her magical instruments detected persistent instabilities in the fundamental forces that govern reality, anomalies that corresponded precisely with the timeline of Set's illegal seizure of power. These measurements provided objective evidence that Set's rule was literally incompatible with cosmic order, creating ongoing stress fractures in the fabric of reality that would eventually result in catastrophic failures if not corrected through the restoration of legitimate succession. The goddess's presentation included visual displays that showed how these instabilities manifested in both divine and mortal realms, creating a compelling case for the urgent necessity of resolving the succession dispute. The appeals to divine precedent that formed a crucial component of the final arguments required extensive research into the historical records maintained by Thoth and his scribal assistants. These archives contain detailed accounts of every significant succession dispute that had occurred since the establishment of divine government, providing a comprehensive database of relevant precedents that could guide the tribunal's decision. The research revealed that in every previous case where legitimate succession had been disrupted through violence or deception, the restoration of proper order had required the active intervention of the supreme divine authorities. The precedent that proved most relevant to the current situation involved a succession dispute that had occurred during the early dynasties of divine rule, when a minor chaos deity had attempted to usurp the throne of a regional god through methods similar to those employed by Set. The historical records showed that the usurper's initial success had been followed by a gradual deterioration of conditions within his domain, culminating in a catastrophic collapse that had required extensive divine intervention to repair. The parallels to the current situation were unmistakable, and provided strong support for Horus's arguments regarding the cosmic necessity of legitimate succession. The mathematical analysis that Thoth provided to support the legal arguments revealed fascinating patterns in the way that divine authority interacted with cosmic forces. The wisdom god's calculations showed that legitimate rulers generated harmonic resonances that amplified the natural forces maintaining universal order, while illegitimate usurpers created dissonant frequencies that gradually weakened the fundamental structures holding reality together. These mathematical proofs provided objective, quantifiable evidence for concepts that had previously been understood only through philosophical or theological reasoning. The tribunal's deliberations extended over several days as the 9 great gods carefully weighed all evidence, testimony, and precedents that had been presented for their consideration. The complexity of the issues involved required extensive discussion of fundamental principles governing divine authority, cosmic order, and the relationship between power and responsibility. Each member of the Aeneid contributed their unique perspective and expertise to the analysis, creating a comprehensive examination of every aspect of the succession dispute. Ra's leadership of the deliberation process ensured that all relevant factors received appropriate consideration, while preventing the discussions from becoming bogged down in minor details or personal grievances. The sun god's experience in resolving complex divine disputes provided him with the skills necessary to guide the tribunal toward a decision that would serve the interests of cosmic order rather than merely satisfying the immediate preferences of individual gods. The moment of final judgment arrived when Ra called for the formal vote that would determine Egypt's rightful ruler. The scales of Ma'at had been positioned to weigh the collective decision of the tribunal, ensuring that their verdict would align with the fundamental principles of cosmic justice, rather than being influenced by political considerations or personal relationships. The scales' golden pans gleamed with inner light as each member of the Aeneid cast their vote, the divine artifact responding to the moral weight of their collective decision. The unanimous verdict in favour of Horus sent shockwaves through the assembled divine community, though the decision had been anticipated by many observers who had followed the extensive proceedings. Set's supporters among the minor deities reacted with dismay and anger, while Horus's allies celebrated the restoration of legitimate divine order. The young god himself maintained a dignified composure that impressed even his former opponents, demonstrating the maturity and wisdom that had convinced the tribunal of his fitness for royal responsibility. The formal proclamation of Horus as the rightful king of Egypt established divine precedent that would influence the legitimacy of earthly pharaohs for thousands of years to come. The principle that royal authority derived from divine appointment rather than personal power alone became a cornerstone of Egyptian political theology, providing ideological foundation for the pharaonic system that would govern the Nile Valley for over 3 millennia. The cosmic mandate that legitimized Horus's rule would be inherited by every subsequent pharaoh who claimed to serve as the living embodiment of the Falcon god on Earth. The unanimous verdict in favour of Horus sent shockwaves through the assembled divine community, though the decision had been anticipated by many observers who had followed the extensive proceedings. Set's supporters among the minor deities reacted with dismay and anger, while Horus's allies celebrated the restoration of legitimate divine order. The young god himself maintained a dignified composure that impressed even his former opponents, demonstrating the maturity and wisdom that had convinced the Tribunal of his fitness for royal responsibility. The transformation of the Great Hall following the Tribunal's decision reflected the cosmic significance of the moment. The eternal flames that had burned with the pure essence of truth throughout the proceedings now blazed with renewed intensity, their light shifting from the harsh white of judgment to the golden radiance of established order. The star map ceiling began displaying new constellations that had not been visible since Osiris's murder, celestial formations that only appeared when legitimate divine authority was properly restored. The mathematical precision of these stellar arrangements created geometric patterns that resonated with the fundamental harmonies governing universal order. Ra's formal announcement of the succession decision required the performance of ancient rituals that had not been conducted for millennia. The sun god's voice carried across multiple dimensional planes as he proclaimed Horus's legitimacy, ensuring that every supernatural entity throughout creation would understand the cosmic mandate that now supported the young Falcon god's authority. The proclamation included specific declarations regarding the divine powers and responsibilities that would transfer to Horus, creating a comprehensive framework for his rule that addressed both immediate governance needs and long-term cosmic stability. The ceremonial preparation for Horus's coronation began immediately following the Tribunal's verdict, as the restoration of legitimate succession required formal recognition through rituals that would align the new king's divine essence with the cosmic forces necessary for effective rule. The ceremony would need to incorporate elements from multiple traditions, combining ancient coronation practices with innovations designed to address the unique circumstances of Horus's ascension. The complexity of these preparations required coordination between dozens of divine specialists, each contributing their expertise to ensure that every aspect of the coronation would properly establish the young god's authority. The regalia of divine kingship had been carefully preserved in sacred vaults since Osiris's death, awaiting the restoration of the legitimate succession. These artifacts represented more than mere ceremonial objects. Each item contained accumulated magical power from every previous legitimate ruler, creating a direct connection between Horus and the unbroken chain of divine authority that stretched back to the creation of the universe. The crown itself consisted of intertwined serpents crafted from metals that existed only in the celestial realm, their bodies forming complex geometric patterns that focused and amplified the wearer's divine abilities. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt required special attention during the coronation preparations, as its two components needed to be magically synchronized to reflect the unified nature of Horus's domain. The white crown of Upper Egypt, carved from a single piece of crystallized sunlight, represented the solar aspects of divine authority and the connection between earthly rule and celestial power. Its surface bore hieroglyphic inscriptions that recorded the names and deeds of every legitimate pharaoh, creating a visual history of Egyptian kingship that would continue to expand as future rulers added their own accomplishments. The red crown of Lower Egypt, fashioned from materials that absorbed and reflected the life-giving properties of the Nile's annual flood, symbolized the fertility and abundance that divine rule was expected to provide for the land and its inhabitants. The crown's distinctive curved projection, resembling the cobra that served as a protective deity for Egyptian royalty, contained concentrated magical essence that could strike down threats to the legitimate ruler with lethal precision. The integration of these two crowns into a unified symbol of authority required rituals that had been developed specifically for Horus's unique position as both solar and lunar deity. The crook and flail, traditional symbols of pharaonic authority, underwent special consecration ceremonies that enhanced their already formidable magical properties. The crook, representing the king's role as shepherd of his people, was carved from wood taken from the first tree that had grown in the primordial waters of creation. Its surface bore intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living wood, while its curved head contained a crystalline core that resonated with the life force of every creature under the ruler's protection. The flail, symbolizing the king's power to defend his domain against threats, consisted of 3 leather strips attached to a handle made from the horn of a celestial bull, each strip inscribed with protective spells that could turn aside both physical and magical attacks. The ceremonial kilt that Horus would wear during his coronation was woven from linen so fine that its threads were virtually invisible to normal sight, creating a garment that appeared to be made from captured starlight. The fabric's surface bore patterns that told the complete story of the succession dispute, from Osiris's murder through the various trials and contests to the final tribunal decision. These images were not merely decorative, but served as a form of magical documentation that would preserve the legitimacy of Horus's claim for all future generations. The broad collar that would complete the royal regalia consisted of multiple rows of precious stones arranged in patterns that corresponded to specific magical formulas. Each gemstone had been selected not only for its beauty but also for its supernatural properties, creating a wearable talisman that would enhance the king's divine abilities while providing protection against various forms of magical attack. The collar's centerpiece was a large falcon crafted from electrum, its eyes formed from perfectly matched rubies that blazed with inner fire when exposed to sunlight. Set's reaction to the tribunal's decision revealed the depth of his rage and his unwillingness to accept defeat gracefully. The Chaos God's initial response involved a series of increasingly desperate appeals to various legal technicalities and procedural irregularities that he claimed had invalidated the proceedings. His arguments demonstrated considerable knowledge of divine law, but failed to address the fundamental legitimacy of Horus's claim or the cosmic necessity of restoring proper succession. The Chaos God's supporters gradually abandoned him, as it became clear that his position was legally untenable and that continued resistance would only result in more severe consequences. The Divine Tribunal's response to Set's appeals was swift and decisive. Ra personally addressed each of the Chaos God's objections, demonstrating that the proceedings had followed proper protocol in every significant detail. The Sun God's analysis revealed that Set's supposed legal grounds were based on misinterpretations of ancient precedents and deliberate distortions of established procedures. The comprehensive nature of Ra's response left no doubt that the tribunal's decision was both legally sound and cosmically necessary. However, the resolution of Set's legal status required careful consideration of his ongoing role within the cosmic order. The Chaos God's destructive tendencies and aggressive nature, while unsuitable for ruling civilized Egypt, served important functions in maintaining the balance between order and disorder that prevented universal stagnation. Complete elimination of Set's influence would create dangerous instabilities that could threaten the fundamental structure of reality itself. The solution proposed by the Divine Tribunal demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cosmic balance and political necessity. Set would be assigned dominion over the desert regions that bordered Egypt, territories that required the kind of harsh leadership that his nature provided, while keeping him sufficiently distant from civilized areas to prevent direct interference with Horus's rule. This arrangement acknowledged Set's legitimate divine status while channeling his destructive tendencies toward appropriate targets such as foreign invaders and chaotic forces that threatened Egyptian security. The desert domains assigned to Set included vast stretches of wasteland that had been considered uninhabitable by most divine beings. These territories contained hidden resources and strategic advantages that could be developed under the Chaos God's aggressive leadership, potentially transforming barren regions into valuable assets for Egypt's overall security. Set's intimate knowledge of desert survival techniques and his natural affinity for the harsh conditions found in these areas made him uniquely qualified to govern territories that would challenge any other deity. The foreign lands that fell under Set's jurisdiction included regions beyond Egypt's traditional boundaries, where his aggressive nature and willingness to use violence would serve Egyptian interests without threatening internal stability. These areas often contained hostile populations or dangerous supernatural entities that required the kind of forceful leadership that Set could provide. His role as guardian of Egypt's borders would utilize his combat skills and strategic thinking while keeping him occupied with challenges that matched his temperament. The cosmic balance maintained through this arrangement satisfied the fundamental requirement that both order and chaos remain active forces within the universal system. Horus's rule over civilized Egypt would provide the stability and prosperity that human populations needed to flourish, while Set's dominion over desert and foreign territories would ensure that the dynamic tensions necessary for continued growth and adaptation remained available when circumstances required them. The restoration of Mut under Horus's reign began immediately following his formal coronation, as the cosmic order that had been disrupted by Set's usurpation required active intervention to repair the damage that had accumulated during decades of illegitimate rule. The principle of Mut encompassed far more than simple justice or legal order. It represented the fundamental harmony that connected all aspects of existence in proper relationship to each other. The restoration process would require careful attention to multiple interconnected systems that had been thrown out of balance by Set's chaotic influence. The Nile's flooding patterns, which had become increasingly erratic during Set's rule, began returning to their traditional cycles within months of Horus's coronation. The river spirits that had been suppressed or driven away by the Chaos God's harsh policies gradually returned to their traditional roles in maintaining the waterway's life-giving properties. The annual flood arrived precisely on schedule for the first time in decades, bringing exactly the right amount of water and fertile silt to ensure optimal agricultural productivity throughout the Nile Valley. The agricultural abundance that followed Horus's restoration of proper river management exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Crops that had struggled to grow during Set's reign now flourished with supernatural vigour, producing yields that surpassed historical records while requiring less labour and resources than previous harvests. The enhanced fertility extended beyond cultivated fields to include wild plants and natural ecosystems that had been degraded by the cosmic imbalances created through illegitimate rule. The divine favour that manifested throughout Egypt under Horus's reign took numerous forms that demonstrated the cosmic approval of legitimate succession. Beneficial weather patterns provided optimal growing conditions, while avoiding the extremes of drought or excessive rainfall that could damage crops or infrastructure. Wild animals that had become aggressive and dangerous during Set's chaotic rule returned to their natural behaviours, while predatory species that had threatened human settlements retreated to appropriate wilderness areas. The restoration of proper cosmic order also affected supernatural phenomena throughout Egypt, as magical energies that had been disrupted by Set's usurpation began flowing in their traditional patterns. Protective spells that had weakened or failed during the Chaos God's reign regained their full effectiveness, while harmful magical influences that had proliferated under illegitimate rule gradually dissipated. The overall magical climate became more stable and predictable, allowing priests and other practitioners to perform their rituals with greater confidence and effectiveness. The establishment of the eternal cycle that would govern future Egyptian kingship represented one of the most significant long-term consequences of Horus's successful claim to the throne. This theological innovation created a direct connection between divine succession and earthly pharaonic authority that would influence Egyptian political theory for over 3,000 years. The principle that every legitimate pharaoh became Horus during life and Osiris after death provided ideological foundation for absolute monarchy, while creating spiritual framework that connected temporal rule to cosmic order. The living pharaoh's identification with Horus granted earthly rulers access to the Falcon god's divine attributes, including his enhanced perception, supernatural strength, and ability to maintain cosmic balance within their domains. This connection was not merely symbolic, but involved actual transfer of divine essence that enhanced the pharaoh's natural capabilities and provided him with supernatural authority over both human subjects and natural forces. The degree of divine enhancement varied depending on the individual ruler's spiritual development and adherence to the principles of Ma'at. The deceased pharaoh's transformation into Osiris created continuity between successive reigns while establishing the spiritual foundation for the elaborate funerary practices that would characterize Egyptian civilization. The dead king's identification with the murdered and resurrected god provided theological justification for mummification, pyramid construction, and the complex rituals designed to ensure successful transition to the afterlife. This cycle created a form of divine succession that transcended individual mortality while maintaining institutional stability. The theological implications of the Horus-Osiris cycle extended far beyond questions of political legitimacy to encompass fundamental concepts regarding the nature of divinity, death, and renewal. The principle that divine essence could transfer between different manifestations while maintaining essential continuity provided a model for understanding how cosmic forces operated across multiple levels of reality. This theological framework would influence Egyptian religious thought for millennia, while providing conceptual foundation for later developments in mystical and philosophical traditions. The practical implementation of the divine kingship model required the development of elaborate coronation ceremonies that would formally establish each new pharaoh's connection to Horus, while ensuring proper transfer of divine authority from the previous ruler. These rituals incorporated elements from the original divine succession dispute, recreating key moments from Horus's triumph over Set, in symbolic form that reinforced the legitimacy of earthly rule. The ceremonies also included specific procedures for invoking divine protection and ensuring that the new pharaoh would receive the supernatural support necessary for effective governance. The administrative systems that developed to support divine kingship reflected the complex requirements of governing a realm, where temporal and spiritual authority were inseparably connected. Royal officials required training in both practical governance techniques and religious procedures that would maintain proper relationship between earthly administration and cosmic order. The bureaucratic structures that emerged from these requirements would prove remarkably durable, providing organizational foundation for one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. Yet even as these earthly systems took shape, the divine realm recognized that Horus himself existed in multiple forms, each representing different aspects of his cosmic authority and serving distinct functions within the celestial hierarchy. The theological complexity surrounding Horus's divine nature became apparent as Egyptian religious thought evolved beyond the simple narrative of succession and revenge. Scholars and priests who studied the Falcon god's attributes discovered that his essence manifested through several distinct personas, each possessing unique characteristics while sharing fundamental connections to the overarching Horus identity. These manifestations were not merely different names for the same deity, but represented genuine variations in divine nature that served specific cosmic functions and responded to different aspects of mortal worship. Horus the Elder, known in the ancient Egyptian language as Horus or Horus the Great, represented the most primordial aspect of the Falcon god's nature. This manifestation predated the Assyrian cycle entirely, existing as an independent sky deity whose worship had flourished along the Nile Valley long before the complex family dramas involving Set's treachery and Osiris's murder had developed into systematic mythology. Horus embodied the raw, elemental power of the Falcon as master of the aerial realm, his divine essence connected directly to the fundamental forces that governed celestial mechanics and atmospheric phenomena. The iconography associated with Horus the Elder emphasized his role as cosmic sovereign rather than earthly king. Ancient depictions showed him as a massive falcon whose wingspan could eclipse the sun, his feathers crafted from crystallized starlight and his eyes blazing with the accumulated radiance of every celestial body in the known universe. His talons, when portrayed in their full divine glory, appeared capable of grasping entire mountain ranges, while his beak could pierce through the barriers separating different dimensional planes. The sheer scale of these representations reflected the primordial nature of this aspect of Horus, whose existence transcended the relatively recent concerns of earthly kingship and divine succession. The worship of Horus centered on his function as the great sky god, whose body formed the celestial vault itself. Devotees understood that when they gazed upward during daylight hours, they were looking upon the underside of the divine falcon's breast, speckled with patterns that manifested as clouds and atmospheric phenomena. The god's wings, stretching from the eastern horizon to the western boundary of the visible world, created the dome that sheltered all terrestrial life while providing the framework within which solar and lunar cycles could operate in their eternal dance. The theological traditions surrounding Horus the Elder described him as existing before the establishment of formal divine hierarchies, when the cosmos operated according to more primitive principles that emphasized direct manifestation of natural forces rather than the complex political relationships that characterized later Egyptian mythology. In this primordial era, Horus functioned as both ruler and realm, his divine consciousness encompassing the entire atmospheric layer, while his physical form provided the structural foundation for celestial mechanics. The ancient hymns dedicated to Horus the Elder revealed sophisticated understanding of astronomical phenomena that had been incorporated into religious doctrine. Priests who specialized in Horus worship maintained detailed observations of stellar movements, planetary cycles, and atmospheric conditions that allowed them to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. This practical knowledge was understood as direct communication with the god himself, whose cosmic awareness encompassed all celestial phenomena, while his divine will influenced their manifestation in ways that affected earthly conditions. The relationship between Horus and the later, more familiar manifestations of Horus created theological challenges that Egyptian religious thinkers addressed through increasingly sophisticated doctrinal developments. Some traditions maintained that Horus the Elder represented the god's eternal, unchanging essence, while his involvement in the Osirian cycle reflected temporary adoption of a more limited persona necessary for interacting with other deities on a more personal level. This interpretation preserved Horus's cosmic significance, while explaining how the same divine essence could simultaneously function as both universal sky god and participant in family conflicts. Alternative theological approaches suggested that the various manifestations of Horus represented different aspects of a single, incomprehensibly complex divine nature that required multiple forms of expression to communicate effectively with different types of worshippers. According to this view, Horus served the needs of those who sought to understand cosmic order and celestial mechanics, while other manifestations addressed more immediate concerns related to kingship, justice, and personal protection. The underlying divine essence remained constant, but its expression varied according to the spiritual and practical needs of different communities. The transition from Horus worship to the more narrative-focused traditions surrounding Horus's conflict with Set reflected broader changes in Egyptian religious thought as the civilization became more politically centralized and socially stratified. The cosmic sky god of earlier periods, while retaining his fundamental importance, became less directly relevant to the immediate concerns of organized kingdoms that required divine justification for earthly authority structures. The younger Horus, with his clear genealogical connections to legitimate rule and his dramatic victory over usurpation, provided more suitable theological foundation for the pharaonic system that was emerging throughout the Nile Valley. Horus the Child, known as Harpocrates in later periods when Greek influence began affecting Egyptian religious terminology, represented another crucial manifestation of the Falcon god's divine nature. This aspect emphasized themes of potential growth and the promise of future greatness rather than the established authority associated with Horus's adult forms. Harpocrates embodied the concept that divine power often manifested through vulnerable appearances that concealed tremendous latent capabilities, a theological principle that resonated with both royal succession practices and broader spiritual concepts regarding hidden strength. The iconographic traditions surrounding Horus the Child drew heavily from the historical circumstances of his birth and early upbringing in the Delta Marshes. Artists typically portrayed Harpocrates as a young boy with a distinctive side lock of hair that marked children and adolescents in ancient Egyptian society. This hairstyle, which involved shaving the head except for a single braided lock that hung down over the right ear, served as a visual indicator of youth while symbolizing the potential for future development that characterized individuals who had not yet reached full maturity. The artistic representations of Harpocrates often included elements that referenced his hidden upbringing and the protective measures that had been necessary to ensure his survival. The young god frequently appeared seated on lotus flowers, symbols of rebirth and emergence from primordial waters that connected his mythology to the broader Egyptian understanding of creation and renewal. The lotus imagery also referenced the marsh environment where he had been raised, while the flowers' association with solar symbolism linked the child god to the cosmic forces he would eventually command as an adult. The protective aspects of Harpocrates' worship developed into elaborate magical traditions that focused on safeguarding children and ensuring successful transitions from youth to adulthood. Parents throughout Egypt invoked the child god's protection for their own offspring, understanding that his experience of surviving threats during his vulnerable early years provided him with unique knowledge regarding the preservation of young lives. Amulets bearing his image became standard protective equipment for children, while ritual practices designed to invoke his blessing accompanied important developmental milestones. The theological significance of Harpocrates extended beyond simple child protection to encompass broader concepts regarding the nature of divine potential and the relationship between apparent weakness and hidden strength. Religious teachers used his mythology to illustrate the principle that cosmic forces often operated through seemingly insignificant manifestations that concealed tremendous power. This understanding influenced Egyptian approaches to education, spiritual development, and political succession, creating cultural values that emphasized the careful nurturing of potential rather than premature attempts to manifest adult capabilities. The magical traditions associated with Horus the Child incorporated sophisticated understanding of developmental psychology and child-rearing practices that reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom regarding human growth and maturation. Priests who specialized in Harpocrates' worship maintained detailed knowledge of childhood diseases, nutritional requirements, and educational techniques that allowed them to provide practical guidance to families while simultaneously addressing spiritual needs related to divine protection and blessing. The festival celebrations honoring Harpocrates created opportunities for community bonding and intergenerational connection that strengthened social cohesion throughout Egyptian society. These events typically involved elaborate processions featuring children dressed as the young god, accompanied by adults portraying the various protective deities and spirits that had safeguarded his early years. The festivals reinforced cultural values regarding the importance of protecting the vulnerable, while celebrating the potential that each new generation represented for continued societal development. The relationship between Harpocrates and adult manifestations of Horus provided theological framework for understanding personal spiritual development and the process through which individuals could cultivate their own divine potential. Religious teaching suggested that every person contained a spark of Horus's essence that could be developed through proper spiritual practices, moral behaviour, and dedication to maintaining cosmic order. The child god's mythology served as a model for this developmental process, illustrating how apparent limitations could be transformed into sources of strength through patience, wisdom, and divine guidance. The local manifestations of Horus throughout Egypt reflected the god's adaptability to different regional needs and cultural traditions, while maintaining his essential identity as the divine Falcon. These localized forms typically incorporated elements specific to their geographical areas, creating variations that addressed particular environmental conditions, economic activities, or historical experiences that distinguished different communities along the Nile Valley. The most significant of these regional manifestations was Horus of Edfu, whose worship center became one of the most important religious sites in ancient Egypt. The Great Temple at Edfu, constructed over several centuries and representing one of the best preserved religious complexes from the ancient world, served as the primary cult center for this particular manifestation of Horus. The massive structure with its towering pylons and elaborately decorated interior chambers was designed to accommodate the specific ritual requirements associated with worshipping the god in his aspect as the great Falcon who soared across the sky while combining solar and celestial attributes. The temple's architectural features incorporated sophisticated, astronomical alignments that allowed sunlight to illuminate specific chambers and decorative elements at predetermined times throughout the year. The Edfu Horus possessed characteristics that distinguished him from other manifestations, while maintaining clear connections to the broader Horus mythology. This version of the god was particularly associated with the concept of divine flight, and the ability to traverse vast distances instantaneously, capabilities that reflected both the natural behaviour of falcons and the cosmic scope of divine authority. The Edfu traditions emphasized Horus's role as a solar deity, whose daily journey across the sky brought light and warmth to the earth, while his nocturnal travels through the underworld ensured the sun's renewal and return each dawn. The ritual practices associated with Horus of Edfu incorporated elaborate ceremonies that recreated the god's celestial journeys in symbolic form. These rituals often involved the use of sacred barks, ceremonial boats that represented the vessels in which the god travelled across the sky and through the underworld during his daily and seasonal cycles. The barks themselves were masterpieces of religious art, decorated with intricate carvings and precious materials that reflected the cosmic significance of the journeys they symbolized. The priesthood that served Horus of Edfu developed specialized knowledge regarding astronomical phenomena, navigation techniques, and the complex mathematical calculations necessary for maintaining accurate religious calendars. Their expertise extended beyond purely religious concerns to encompass practical applications that benefited the broader community, including agricultural planning, architectural design, and the coordination of trade expeditions that required precise timing and navigation skills. The fusion of Horus with Ra as Ra-Harakti represented one of the most significant theological developments in Egyptian religious history, creating a composite deity that combined the falcon god's attributes with the supreme solar deity's cosmic authority. This synthesis reflected the natural affinity between Horus's solar characteristics and Ra's role as the primary sun god, while addressing practical needs for religious unification that arose as Egyptian political centralization progressed. The combined deity embodied both the fierce, predatory nature of the divine Falcon and the life-giving, nurturing aspects of solar radiance. The iconography of Ra-Horakhti incorporated visual elements from both constituent deities while creating new symbolic representations that emphasized their unified nature. The composite god typically appeared as a falcon-headed figure crowned with the solar disk, his human body representing the anthropomorphic aspects of divine authority, while his raptor head maintained connection to the aerial realm and hunting prowess. The solar disk above his head blazed with intensity that surpassed either deity individually, suggesting that their combination had created something greater than the sum of its parts. The theological implications of the Ra-Horakhti fusion extended far beyond simple religious syncretism to encompass fundamental questions regarding the nature of divine identity and the relationship between different aspects of cosmic authority. The successful integration of these two major deities demonstrated that Egyptian religious thought had developed sophisticated methods for reconciling potentially conflicting divine attributes while preserving the essential characteristics that made each deity valuable to their worshippers. The worship practices associated with Ra-Horakhti required careful balance between the different ritual traditions that had developed around the constituent deities. Priests serving this composite god needed training in both solar worship techniques and falcon-related ceremonies, creating a specialized religious profession that demanded extensive knowledge and considerable skill. The resulting ritual practices incorporated elements from multiple traditions while developing innovations that addressed the unique characteristics of the fused deity. The political significance of Ra-Horakhti worship reflected the composite deity's usefulness for legitimizing pharaonic authority through connection to both royal falcon symbolism and supreme solar divinity. Kings who claimed to embody this fused god could draw upon the fierce protective instincts associated with Horus, while simultaneously accessing the cosmic authority that Ra's solar supremacy provided. This theological framework proved particularly valuable for rulers who sought to emphasize both their military capabilities and their role as maintainers of cosmic order. The establishment of the Horus name as the primary royal title created a direct and unbreakable connection between every legitimate pharaoh and the divine falcon's authority. This naming convention, which preceded all other royal epithets and titles, transformed each king into a living manifestation of Horus's earthly presence. The Horus name was not merely ceremonial, but represented an actual transfer of divine essence that enhanced the pharaoh's natural capabilities while binding him to the cosmic responsibilities that divine kingship entailed. Archaeological evidence from the earliest dynasties shows that this practice began with the first unified rulers of Egypt and continued without interruption for over 3,000 years. The selection of each pharaoh's Horus name required elaborate consultations with priestly astronomers who analysed celestial conditions at the time of coronation to determine which aspects of the Falcon god's nature would be most prominent during the new ruler's reign. These calculations incorporated complex mathematical formulas that related planetary positions, stellar configurations, and lunar cycles to specific divine attributes, creating personalized connections between individual pharaohs and particular manifestations of Horus's power. The resulting names often predicted or influenced the major achievements and challenges that would characterize each reign. The practical implementation of divine kingship through Horus identification required extensive bureaucratic systems that could translate cosmic authority into effective earthly governance. Royal administrators developed sophisticated protocols for invoking divine sanction for major policy decisions, military campaigns, and legal judgments that affected the kingdom's welfare. These procedures ensured that pharaonic authority remained connected to its divine source while providing practical mechanisms for governing a complex civilization that spanned hundreds of miles along the Nile Valley. The military applications of Horus symbolism proved particularly significant in establishing Egyptian dominance over neighbouring regions and maintaining internal security against potential rebellions. Pharaonic armies carried standards featuring falcon imagery that served both as rallying points for Egyptian forces and as psychological weapons designed to intimidate enemies who understood the supernatural power these symbols represented. The sight of falcon banners advancing across battlefields became synonymous with Egyptian military might, while the king's personal presence on campaign was understood to bring Horus's divine protection to his soldiers. The judicial system that developed under divine kingship incorporated Horus's role as the god who had successfully challenged illegitimate authority and restored cosmic justice through legal proceedings. Egyptian courts operated under the principle that the pharaoh's judgment carried divine authority because he embodied the Falcon god who had triumphed over Set through proper legal channels rather than mere violence. This theological foundation created a legal system that emphasized procedural correctness and appeals to higher authority rather than simple enforcement through physical power. The architectural monuments that Egyptian civilization produced over 3 millennia consistently incorporated Horus symbolism in ways that demonstrated the enduring influence of the Falcon god's mythology on artistic and cultural expression. Pyramid complexes, temple structures and royal tombs featured falcon imagery that served both decorative and functional purposes, creating physical manifestations of divine authority that reinforced the theological foundations of pharaonic rule. The mathematical precision required for these constructions reflected the cosmic order that Horus represented, while their massive scale demonstrated the earthly power that divine kingship could mobilize. The artistic traditions that flourished under Egyptian civilization developed distinctive styles and techniques for representing Horus in various manifestations, creating visual languages that could communicate complex theological concepts to both literate priests and ordinary citizens who relied on imagery for religious instruction. The standardization of falcon iconography across different regions and time periods created cultural unity that transcended local variations while allowing for creative innovations that reflected changing artistic sensibilities and technological capabilities. The hieroglyphic writing system that preserved Egyptian literature, religious texts, and administrative records incorporated Horus symbolism at fundamental levels that influenced how the civilization understood and expressed abstract concepts related to authority, protection, and divine intervention. The Falcon hieroglyph served multiple functions within written texts, representing not only the god himself but also broader concepts related to kingship, divine favour, and cosmic order. This linguistic integration ensured that Horus's influence permeated every aspect of literate culture, while providing consistent symbolic frameworks for complex theological discussions. The religious literature that Egyptian scribes produced over millennia included thousands of hymns, prayers, ritual texts, and mythological narratives that explored different aspects of Horus's nature and celebrated his various achievements. These texts served both practical liturgical functions and educational purposes, preserving theological knowledge while making it accessible to different audiences with varying levels of religious sophistication. The literary traditions surrounding Horus influenced narrative techniques, poetic conventions, and philosophical approaches that extended far beyond purely religious contexts. The magical practices that developed around Horus worship incorporated the god's mythology into practical systems for protection, healing, and problem-solving that addressed the everyday needs of Egyptian society. Amulets bearing falcon imagery became standard protective equipment for people of all social classes, while ritual procedures invoking Horus's power provided frameworks for addressing medical emergencies, agricultural challenges, and personal crises. These magical traditions preserved ancient wisdom regarding herbal medicine, psychological counselling, and community support systems while embedding them within religious contexts that provided spiritual meaning and social validation. The funerary beliefs that characterized Egyptian civilization drew heavily upon the Horus-Osiris cycle to create comprehensive systems for ensuring successful transitions from earthly life to existence in the afterworld. The identification of deceased pharaohs with Osiris while living rulers embodied Horus created theological frameworks that addressed both individual mortality and institutional continuity. These beliefs influenced mummification techniques, tomb construction, and burial practices that preserved Egyptian culture's most distinctive characteristics while serving practical functions related to public health and social stability. The symbolic resonance of Horus's triumph over Set transcended its original mythological context to become the archetypal narrative of legitimate authority prevailing over illegitimate usurpation. This story provided template for understanding political conflicts, moral struggles, and cosmic battles between order and chaos that resonated with human experiences across different cultures and historical periods. The universal themes embedded within Horus's mythology ensured its continued relevance, even as the specific religious and political systems that originally supported it evolved or disappeared. The concept of good triumphing over evil that Horus's victory represented became fundamental to Egyptian moral philosophy and ethical systems that guided both individual behaviour and social institutions. The story's emphasis on legal proceedings, rather than simple violence, provided models for conflict resolution that influenced Egyptian approaches to diplomacy, criminal justice, and civil disputes. The principle that legitimate authority could be established through proper procedures rather than mere force created cultural values that emphasized law, precedent, and institutional continuity over personal charisma or military success. The influence of divine kingship concepts that originated with Horus's mythology extended far beyond Egypt's borders to affect political systems throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern regions. Neighbouring civilizations adopted modified versions of pharaonic ideology that incorporated local deities and cultural traditions while preserving the essential principle that royal authority derived from divine appointment rather than human consent or military conquest. These adaptations created networks of related political systems that shared common theological foundations, despite significant differences in specific religious practices and governmental structures. The magical practices that developed around Horus worship proved remarkably durable, surviving the decline of ancient Egyptian civilization to influence later magical traditions throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Eye of Horus became one of the most recognizable protective symbols in human history, appearing in contexts ranging from medieval grimoires to modern occult practices. The mathematical symbolism associated with the eye's fractional representations influenced numerical systems and geometric principles that affected architecture, art, and scientific thinking in cultures that had no direct connection to ancient Egypt. The astronomical knowledge that Egyptian priests accumulated through centuries of observing celestial phenomena in connection with Horus worship contributed to mathematical and scientific developments that influenced later civilizations throughout the ancient world. The precise calculations required for maintaining religious calendars, predicting eclipses, and timing ceremonial events created databases of observational information that proved valuable for navigation, agriculture, and architectural projects. This practical knowledge was often transmitted through religious contexts that preserved it even when the original theological frameworks that supported it were no longer widely accepted. The artistic techniques and aesthetic principles that Egyptian craftsmen developed while creating representations of Horus influenced visual traditions throughout the Mediterranean region and established standards for religious art that continued to affect creative expression for millennia. The mathematical proportions used in Falcon imagery, the colour symbolism associated with solar and lunar attributes, and the integration of hieroglyphic elements with pictorial representations created artistic languages that could communicate complex ideas through visual means alone. The The enduring power of Horus's imagery and symbolism reflects the universal human need for archetypal narratives that provide meaning and structure for understanding existence within cosmic contexts that extend far beyond individual experience. The Falcon god's mythology addresses fundamental questions regarding the nature of authority, the relationship between power and responsibility, and the cosmic forces that govern both natural phenomena and human societies. These themes remain relevant across different cultures and historical periods because they address persistent aspects of human experience that transcend specific religious or political systems. The concept of divine kingship that Horus's mythology established provided ideological foundation for monarchical systems throughout the ancient world, while influencing modern concepts of governmental legitimacy and political authority. The principle that rulers derive their power from sources beyond human consensus created frameworks for understanding sovereignty that continue to influence constitutional theory, international law, and political philosophy. Even democratic systems that explicitly reject divine right theories often incorporate elements derived from ancient concepts of cosmic order and legitimate authority. The legacy of the divine falcon thus extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Egyptian civilization to encompass fundamental aspects of human culture, religious thought, and political organization that continue to shape contemporary societies. Horus's triumph over chaos, his restoration of cosmic order, and his establishment of legitimate kingship created archetypal patterns that resonate with universal human experiences while providing practical models for addressing persistent challenges related to governance, justice, and social organization. The enduring influence of his mythology demonstrates the power of well-crafted narratives to transcend their original contexts and provide meaning and guidance for successive generations facing similar fundamental questions about the nature of existence, authority, and cosmic purpose. Through 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization and countless subsequent cultural adaptations, the Divine Falcon story has proven its capacity to inspire, instruct, and unite human communities around shared values and common purposes. The mathematical precision of the Eye of Horus, the protective power of falcon imagery, and the moral clarity of legitimate authority triumphing over usurpation continue to provide symbols and concepts that help humans navigate the complexities of existence while maintaining connections to cosmic forces greater than individual experience. In this way, Horus's legacy represents not merely an ancient religious tradition, but a continuing source of wisdom and inspiration that enriches human understanding of divine purpose, earthly responsibility, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defines the human condition.